Dear guests, please welcome Executive Director of the Nobel Peace Center, Liv Tørres.
I have an image frozen in my head, an image of an African woman at the seaside in the West African country of Mauritania. We're 30 years back. I had just landed during what quickly turned into the Senegal-Mauritania conflict, triggered by issues of drought, water access problems, and land rights. I still remember the tensions. Senegal threw Arabs out. Mauritania sent Africans out. Rapid armament on both sides. Borders disputed. And the African woman stood there at the seaside, watching out at sea, waiting for her husband to come back from fishing and hoping to avoid being evicted without him. The catastrophic droughts and the expanding desertification in the Sahel belt contributed to the world's attention being turned towards environmental security. In the following years, we learned new words: environmental security, environmental conflicts, global warming. At some stage, we stopped talking about the environment and started talking about climate and climate change instead. In 2004, Wangari Maathai got the first Nobel Peace Prize focusing on the link between the environment and peace. And in 2007, the Peace Prize was awarded to Al Gore and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Over the past 30 years, our knowledge has increased. We know now a lot more about the dangers, risks, and the solutions. Yet, action is limited, and climate change is accelerating. There are several reasons for the lack of or limited progress. Some of them you will hear more about over the next 2 days. But more than addressing the past, however, we need to address the future. We need to address solutions, and we need urgently to address action. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues, welcome to Oslo Pax. My name is Liv Tørres, and I'm the lucky Executive Director of the Nobel Peace Center. And to us, this is a very historic event, a very special event. It's the first international peace conference arranged by the Nobel Peace Center. And we plan to have annual peace conferences like this. A special kind of peace conference, one which focuses on dialogue, intergenerational meetings, meetings between youth and influencers on the one hand, and decision makers on the other. A conference which aims for results and concrete solutions as a decisive step in global peace building. I want to thank all of you for coming, to those of you who have traveled far, to those of you who are linked up electronically, and to those speakers who, in order to save CO2 emissions, have remained in their lands at home and will be linked up on video. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Christiana Figueres for coming all this way and taking overall responsibility for the conference input. I'm particularly happy to see so many young people here today. Youth have managed to put climate change firmly on the world agenda through the climate strikes and through concrete action and mobilization. Now it's up to decision makers to listen and to actually take responsibility. This is a call to action on one of the most important questions the world is facing today, climate change. I want to thank the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for supporting this event and for great cooperation in preparing it. I also want to thank our sponsors, Telenor, Hydro, and ABB, and not the least Hyundai and Flytoget for making this event eco-friendly. And the fact that some of our visitors got stuck on the way from the airport yesterday because we were running out of electricity on the car is totally our responsibility and not the responsibility of Hyundai. And it made it all a lot more fun as well, I must admit. I'm not sure if Kumi Naidu thinks that, but he's here so he can respond to that later. Thanks to all good partners and friends who have cooperated with us in the preparations. Prio, Cicero, Spire, Changemaker, Climates, Accord, JCI, and ICDPB, as well as all the young activists who have given input of high value to the whole event. During these 2 days, we will listen to inspiring speakers, discuss important topics, and hopefully make new friends and bonds. But we shall also do some real peace work. I hope you have all signed up for the roundtables this afternoon and tomorrow, working tables where the summaries will provide input to the chair summary that will be handed over to the UN Climate Summit later this month. My ambition is that Oslo Pax, our call for action on peace and climate change, will be talked about and acted upon in the weeks and months to come. In that way, step by step, we change the world in a better direction. Now, we are honored to have the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs here today to perform the official opening of Oslo Pax. Please welcome Ine Erikesen Søreide.
Good morning, everyone, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and also Nobel Peace Prize laureate. This July was the warmest month on Earth since at least 1850. And up in Svalbard, we have observed record temperatures every month since December 2010. Severe weather events that used to happen once every century now happens maybe 2 or 3 times a decade. Sometimes even more often. Extreme weather events affect many parts of the world. In the Sahel, there are increasing number of conflicts because of lack of water and land for farming. As the Lake Chad shrinks, the livelihoods of entire population groups are disappearing, and it's the perfect breeding ground for extremism and terrorism. In Iraq, water scarcity undermining prospects for lasting peace. In Afghanistan, in Yemen, water tables have fallen dramatically. And rising sea levels and hurricanes, some of them we can see in the news today as we speak, they hit a number of island states. I recently visited Tuvalu, which is a small island in the South Pacific. And I also saw the existential threats that they are facing. And to put it very simply and easily, when the ice melts in the Arctic, the sea level rises in the South Pacific. Small island developing states are maybe one of the most vulnerable states we have. They are not responsible for the climate change, but they are highly affected by it. All of this are clear signs that the global climate change is accelerating even faster than scientists had feared. And to put it in the words of Secretary General Tørres, climate change is now moving faster than we are. We must meet this realization with the urgency to act. A few weeks ago, I gave my annual opening address to the Global Outlook event at Arendalsuka. And my first point was to describe the so-called normal is over. And I described it with climate change, I said, firstly, I want to make a point of starting with one area that is paradoxically too often left out in the discussion of geopolitics, namely climate change. I say paradoxically because geopolitics is about analyzing the influence of geography on international politics. Typically, we see geography as relatively fixed, allowing us to make predictions about political choices. But it may well be that when we look back at this era, the biggest change to our normality will not be political shifts, but the changes to geography itself due to climate change. A changing geography globally in terms of temperatures, extreme weather events, availability of water, sustainability of food production, rising sea level, scarcity of resources in many regions, brings with it the potential for conflict, humanitarian crisis, and migration. And that is also why, in June, Norway put climate change, peace, and security on the agenda of the Oslo Forum, which is the world's leading retreat for peace mediators. Let me acknowledge then the timeliness of Oslo Pax, and I commend the Nobel Peace Center for convening this on peace and climate. The risks associated with climate-related disasters are already a reality for millions of people around the world, and the risks are not going away. In the latest edition of the Global Risk Report, the World Economic Forum ranks environmental threats on top of the list for the third year in a row, both in terms of impact and of likelihood. Extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change are listed as the risk most likely to happen over the next 10 years. I often refer to climate change as a threat multiplier, in particular in conditions of weak governance and institutions, fragility and insecurity. It can increase tensions and conflict. Climate change threatens human security by impacting economic growth, food prices, undermining livelihoods, and prompting displacement and forced migration. The World Bank estimates that without urgent climate action, more than 140 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America will migrate within their own country's borders by 2050, putting a lot of pressure and strain on the coping capacities of already vulnerable communities and cities. While the impact of climate change is spread unevenly across different regions, it remains clear that this is a global challenge which will affect us all in the long term. Major armies, major defense ministries like Pentagon, major businesses, they have realized this long ago. They have planned for how climate change is a threat multiplier and can cause conflict. They have assessed that political leadership and diplomacy is lagging behind, and we cannot let it lag behind. We must act now with a sense of urgency and commitment to place people, and especially those most vulnerable and marginalized, at the center of our efforts. And even if we curb emissions to the 1.5 degree goal, and even if we improve our climate security response, for many people around the world, that response will be too little too late. A strong focus on adaptation and disaster risk management is necessary to ensure that we can sustain and advance the national development priorities and achieve the 2030 agenda. We must invest in resilience. In economic terms alone, that makes sense. According to the World Bank again, investing in more resilient infrastructure will give $4 in benefit for every dollar invested. But investing in resilience also presents a huge opportunity to support employment and development, which ultimately enhances security. Norway will increase our support to climate adaptation, to resilience, and to food security. This will complement what we are already doing within humanitarian assistance. And I would like to underline here that one of the reasons why Norway's humanitarian budget has increased with almost 65% over the past 6 years is climate change. We are facing more complex and more long-lasting crises, and many of them stem from or are enhanced by climate change. The average humanitarian crisis nowadays lasts for 8 years. And they come again and again and again in the same areas. Climate change is increasingly and frequently an important part of the context, not only for humanitarian crisis, but also in our focus on fragile and vulnerable states, for our peace and reconciliation efforts, and for our security policy. Ladies and gentlemen, the UN Security Council has the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. The climate security nexus is, in our opinion, to be firmly placed on the Council's agenda. Germany has started this work, and as you know, we are a candidate for the Security Council as well, hoping to pick up the torch after Germany, and we are already cooperating very closely on this bilaterally. In my view, the Security Council should both acknowledge that climate change is a concrete and existential threat to humanity, and that developing countries are particularly at risk and vulnerable. So mitigating climate-related disaster impacts, it benefits global stability and conflict prevention. We also have to engage the whole UN system on climate change. The UN Security Council has one special role, which is to mandate on the security impacts of climate change, and it's complementary to the mandate of other UN bodies. We have to increase the analytical capacity of the UN to better understand the climate fragility risks and formulate evidence-based responses. We have to support improvement of early warning systems. Sometimes we say that Norway and Pacific states are like the canaries in the coal mine because we see climate change very soon. I mean, in the Arctic, climate change is happening twice as fast as anywhere else on Earth. So we can predict what is going to happen, but can we do something about the prediction? That's the big question. And we also need to convene regular briefings on climate risks and progress made. Climate change, ladies and gentlemen, is not something that respects national borders or national sovereignty. It is one of the topics that no single country can solve alone. It is maybe, as I see it, the most prominent issue when we talk about the need for strengthening multilateralism and international cooperation. This is an issue we cannot do alone. It is just simply not an option. This also serves as a very good backdrop for why we presented a white paper to Parliament in June on multilateralism, Norway's role, and how to strengthen it. I presented it together, again, with my German colleague, Heiko Maas, and I do think that by rising to this challenge, we can demonstrate the purpose of the multilateral system, the purpose of international cooperation that makes us take risks and commit ourselves beyond our own narrow self-interests. So I wish all of you good luck with Oslo Pax, and I look forward to receiving the outcome that I know will be a result of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ine Erikesen Søreide. Now, for us at the Nobel Peace Center, it's always a pleasure to welcome Nobel Peace Prize laureates. And this one, in particular, an old friend of the Nobel Peace Center. Our next speaker received the Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 32 as one of the youngest laureates ever. She stood on the barricades for freedom of expression and human rights in her home country, Yemen, and became a driving force in the Arab Spring in 2011. She knows that young people are capable of making change happen. Please give a warm welcome to the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Tawakkol Karman.
شكرا جزيلا. السلام عليكم. Peace be upon all of you. I'm so happy to be here again in my second country in Norway, in Oslo. And I am so honored to be in this first conference of Nobel Peace Center. And I'm so happy that there are a lot of youth here listening to me. Dear friends, dear brothers and sisters, today we're witnessing mass violation of human rights around the world. Despotism, nationalism, militarism, terrorism, and populism are on the rise, fracturing hundreds of years of a progressive democratic experiment that began with the European Enlightenment that remains an ideal to the present day. The world also is experiencing an unprecedented increase in the number of refugees, which is often seen as a security issue. In fact, it is a political issue par excellence. Tyrants are driving this current crisis by unleashing killing, torture, mass detention, and terror against their people, who call for freedom, democracy, justice, and rule of law, in order to control them and in order to remain in power. Dear friends, even as the nations continue to veer towards predatory populism and despotism, our planet is also facing unprecedented threats. Our very existence on this planet is threatened. Climate change, flooding, fires, dwindling water reserves, biodiversity loss, pollution, widespread extinction, and so on. Regrettably, the recent Amazon fires have received inadequate attention by the world. The forests, covering over 5 million square kilometers and often called the lungs of the planet, deserves much more consideration, given its great importance for ecological balance and the reduction of greenhouse gas emission. In this regard, I repeat and I reiterate my calling for an international tribunal specialized on the environmental issues, as environmental crimes are ultimately offenses against human beings. Our small village is fraught with danger and potential conflicts. Giving the world a stockpile of arms, nuclear, bombs, and bioweapons, we have at this very moment the potential to destroy our planet hundreds of times over. We are at a crossroads in our shared history, current, and future, a dangerous time. So, instead of the inevitable conflict, we must make world peace an inevitable choice for all. Hatred and conflict among nations and between peoples, religions, races, and genders pose a clear and present danger to the very existence of us all. They feed global terrorism, and they prevent us from focusing on our most dire issue, the health and well-being of our Mother Earth. The urgent need for something like a global government should be achieved. The urgent need for something like a global government through either the modernization and development United Nations mechanisms or the establishment of new organizations that can deal effectively with future challenges is not just wishful thinking, it is a necessity. The human being really need the real global government. This international body should wield broad powers and be empowered with the capability to make decisions, fund plans, and develop strategies. This is an urgent act that we need. Dear sisters and brothers, dear friends, before ending, I want to talk to you about my country, Yemen. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are destroying my country. They claim that they came to restore the legitimacy, while they destroy the legitimacy, while they kill people everywhere, while they prevent the president from returning to the country, while they occupy islands, ports, airports, and they commit mass killing everywhere. Just for example, an example, day before yesterday, they killed more than 150 prisoners by their air forces, while these prisoners were preparing themselves to return to their families. The Houthi militia also, they are committing other crimes against humanity. So I'm calling from here, from Norway, to stop this war. I'm calling here all the human beings to help Yemenis, to force Saudi and UAE to leave Yemen now. They built another new militia. They said they came to help Yemen against militia of al-Houthi, while they create another militia that are destroying Yemen. They want to divide Yemen to parts. They want Yemen to remain and to be a failed country. But they are wrong. Yemen people is very strong. Yemeni people will not give up. Yemeni people will keep struggling for their democracy, for their freedom, for their unity, and nobody, no country will force us to give up and fail. Dear young people, combating tyranny, poverty, promoting peace and human rights, and protecting our planet are the headlines that express our common struggle. It's the headlines of your duty as young people. With all the darkness around us, there is hope. Do you know why this hope? Because of you, youth. Because of you, young people around the world. Your participating in public life is increasing everywhere and in every country. So keep your involvement in the public life and raise your voice and know the one who will free this country, who will free this world from despotism, from racism, from corruption, from injustice is you, young people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tawakkol. Now, Oslo is famous for being the city of the Nobel Peace Prize. At least that is what we like to think. I'm not sure if Raymond would like to add some more things coming on just now. But this year, Oslo is also the European Green Capital. This makes Oslo the capital for peace and climate at the same time, and the perfect place for a gathering on peace and climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the governing mayor of Oslo, Raymond Johansen.
Pleasure for me to invite you all to Oslo and the first ever Oslo Pax conference. I strongly welcome this initiative taken by the Nobel Peace Center. I'm especially glad that you have chosen to set climate change on the agenda for the first Oslo Pax conference. It fits perfect into Oslo's year as a European green capital. Like most of the cities in the world, Oslo is facing a changing reality, fueled by what I see as the four main drivers for change. The first driver is globalization. Globalization has brought us closer together. It has increased trade and lifted millions out of poverty. Norway has benefited greatly. We export raw materials at high price and buy cheap goods in return. The second driver is urbanization. Half of the world's population now live in cities. Population growth in the Nordic countries is mainly taking place in urban areas. Oslo is no exception. The third driver is digital. New technology changes our markets and our lives. It happens so quickly that we hardly know what tomorrow will look like. Many jobs considered safe today will be lost, while new jobs will emerge. Oslo wants to take a part in this transformation. Climate change is the fourth driver. In the last few years, world leaders have taken ambitious and necessary decisions by adopting landmark agreements, such as UN Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement. I strongly support that to implement the Sustainable Development Goal, but we need faster progress because we live in a special moment. We are the first generation who can see the effects of the climate change, and probably the last generation that can do something with it. Combating climate change cannot be left by somewhere else at another time. We need to act here and now. And we who live in cities have a special responsibility to take action. Cities represent 80% of the global economy and 70% of the global energy consumption, which is the biggest cause of greenhouse gas emissions. Cities are obviously a central part of the problem. At the same time, some of the most powerful solutions are also to be found in cities. The role of cities has increased in recent years. Cities are not bound by international diplomacy. We can act, even if state leaders may drag their feet, as they often do. I have to tell you, the same day as we were the European Green Capital, the President Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And the day after, the mayors all throughout the US, they started an organization called We Are Still In. It means that they are still in to fulfill the obligation from the Paris Agreement. Cities counts. Cities are strong. Cities will be the powerful force in combating climate change. Cities are handling problems close to people, and our citizens expect us to deliver solutions. To reach international climate targets, city leaders must take action. The city of Oslo won the Paris Agreement Capital Award for 2019. I see this as a great acknowledgement from the European Commission. We are ambitious and we aim to lead. Oslo has one of the most ambitious climate strategies with goals in accordance with Paris Agreement. In accordance with Paris Agreement, our goal is to reduce greenhouse gases by 95% by 2030. We are probably the first city in the world to introduce a climate budget, which is closely linked out to the fiscal budget. Everything we do financially is also assessed climate-wise. We reinforce government policy with local measures. The national government has made it cheaper to buy electric vehicles, and Oslo has made it cheap and easy to use. This year, Oslo, more than 2/3 of all new private cars sold are electric vehicles. Oslo is also leading a way towards emission-free construction sites, a big source of emissions in our city, and cities throughout the world is growing. So this is really a challenge that we have to address. Oslo is also strongly a believer in the circular economy, where we act by turning food waste into biogas for the city's buses and waste trucks. And I will mention this. Oslo is also using its purchasing power to enhance the green transition. Oslo buys goods and services for 27 billion Norwegian kroner each year. And we need and we have to use our power. And I say that to the state as well. We can use our power to change the market. If we are willing to do so, it's about courage and political will. Oslo is also in the process of implementing all-time high investments in public transport. Some say it takes courage to make these changes. I would turn it around and say, who dare not to make these changes? Implementing radical change, however, require a broad public support. That is why we want the European Green Capital Year 2019 to be a motivator for citizens' green transformation. I hope this conference will serve the same purpose, to motivate for action on peace and climate change, inspired by the Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you and good luck with the conference today.
Dear guests, it's an honor to introduce the chair of Oslo Pax 2019, convener of Mission 2020, and former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christiana Figueres.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the Oslo Peace Center for convening the very first conference on peace, on the relationship between peace and climate change, because as we have heard consistently this morning, that is a very crucial nexus. Also, thank you very much for demonstrating where oil barrels belong. Reconverted into podiums, not full, not being exported, reconverted into a very, very convenient little podium. So thank you for demonstrating what the future is going to be. I thought this morning I would take you on a little journey to the year 2050, because we have heard consistently this morning where we are. I don't need to repeat what we are seeing going on, but I thought it might be important to remind us all that currently we are making a choice about what future we're all going to share. My grandfather lived until he was 105, so and he was Danish, a good Viking, and so I'm assuming that I will be somewhere around the 100 years. So maybe I'll be there in 2050, but most of you today here will definitely be around in the year 2050. So I would like to point out and take you on a little journey, because right now, and particularly over the next 10 years, we will determine what life will be like in the year 2050. And I'm going to do that with a very sophisticated technological prop, which is a piece of paper. Now, have this piece of paper be the equivalent of about 40 gigatons per year, which is what we are emitting as a globe. And the Paris Agreement would have us reduce emissions, but frankly, that's not what we see going on. Instead of seeing a reduction of this, what we're actually seeing right now is I have no idea how much, but let's say that by 2050, instead of having reduced what the Paris Agreement says, let's say that we would have maybe that much, let's say 60, 70, 80, I don't know. But we're definitely on track right now to increase emissions. That is where we're going. So, if that were to continue, what would the year 2050 look like? Imagine that when you go out of your home, you cannot go without a mask. You have to wear a mask every time that you leave your home, because the air is so polluted in every single city that you cannot breathe without a very specifically designed mask. Imagine that the temperatures have now risen beyond 3.7 additional, that we're actually on track to 4, 5 degrees additional average temperature. Do you know what that would mean? That means that those who work outside can do so no longer. No longer possible to work outside. Food would not be able to be produced outside as we're producing it now. We would have to produce food inside greenhouses. I'm not saying specific food. I'm saying the entire food to feed the world population. The Sahara Desert in the year 2019, in fact, even in the year 2020, used to be in Africa. By 2050, under these conditions, the Sahara Desert would already be creeping into Europe. Australia used to have the Great Barrier Reef. It is now the greatest aquatic cemetery in the world. We used to have inland glaciers. Do you remember the glaciers on the Alps, on the Andes, on the Himalayas? Gone. They used to protect snow and ice in the winter and melt slowly in the spring and summer to provide water. That water is gone to at least 1 billion people that used to depend on that water. The equatorial belt, and here I'm reaching into your classes of geography. Do you all remember where the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn are? That equatorial belt has now been rendered practically uninhabitable because of temperature and because of the lack of water. Which means that the millions of people who used to live there are now pressing up into the northern countries and down into the southern countries. You can begin to imagine the political and economic crisis that that is already producing. You can imagine the very natural, understandable, question mark, reaction of countries that are closing their borders, that are protecting their food sources, that are protecting their water sources. There are food riots, there are civil wars, there is income inequality, the likes of what we have never seen. That's the year 2050. I'm not exaggerating any of this. It is all scientific projections, all of it. That is the world, my friends, that the young people are demonstrating against in the streets. And they are fully justified about doing that, because that's where we're going. Now, here is the good news. We are not condemned to that world. We are not condemned. Right now, we have a choice, and we have to exercise that choice. And here is the choice, with my little piece of paper. 40 gigatons that we are now emitting, okay? 40 gigatons. Over the next 10 years, by 2030, we have to halve those emissions to 20 gigatons. Over the next 10 years after that, from 2030 to 2040, half again. How many gigatons do we have? Come on, folks, you do have some math, don't you? 40 divided by 40 divided in half is 20. 20 divided in half is 10. Thank you very much. And over the last 10 years, before 2050, we divided again, and we have 5. Good. Even in Costa Rica and in Norway. Fantastic. 5 gigatons for the last decade before 2050. 5 gigatons is what we can naturally absorb as a system. Now, if we do this, which frankly is the only choice that we have, here is what 2050 will look like. Here is what 2050 will look like. You walk out of your house, and the temperature and the air has never been fresher. There are trees everywhere. 50% of the world is covered with, 50% of the land is covered with trees, because we started the most amazing tree planting campaign that humanity has ever conceived. Cities are no longer being used by cars and roads and bridges. Cities are being used by people. Cities are green. There are barely any privately owned cars because everything is public transportation. And that transportation is efficient. And it is, of course, zero emitting. And people are walking more and biking more. And they go from park to park. And we have such amazing video conferencing, which are no longer called video conferencing, I just don't know what they're going to be called, but we have such amazing systems that we don't need to travel to all of these fantastic conferences anymore, because we can actually participate with equal power as though we were physically present. And we have the capacity to work from home, because all of the technologies have been developed in order for us not to have to travel 60, 70, 80 kilometers to work and back. So we're working from home. And we have rediscovered the beauty of local food production, because every rooftop is producing food. Every garden is producing food. Every wall is either painted with solar paint, producing energy, or covered with verdant vines. And we're doing things in community. And we travel only in what I would call slowcations. You don't travel anymore like the craziness that I'm doing, 1 week to Europe for 3 meetings and then back to Costa Rica. Crazy. Now, in 2050, in a reasonable and thriving world, we actually travel for a month because we can work while we travel, and we travel with a very different purpose to experience the beauty of the rest of the world. That is a world in which we have co-created abundance because we're all involved in local food production. We have more water than we need because we're desalinating that with solar energy. We have more energy than we need, and it's free because the cost of the sun is 0 and the cost of the wind is 0, and they have never sent us a bill for the energy that we are deriving from them. That is the world that we want. That is the world that we adults have the responsibility to turn over to the young people. It is not the responsibility of young people to solve the problems that we have caused. It is our responsibility, and I'm looking at the first row and the second row, not at the rest, because we cannot leave this planet on track to the first world that I have described. We leave this planet on track to the second world. The world, the only world that we can actually choose. What that actually means is moving our head, our mental mindset from extraction to regeneration, from a linear economy to a circular economy, from individual benefit, what can I get out of this, to the common good. And of course, from short-term thinking, suicidal, to long-term thinking and acting. What that means is simply redesigning the whole human presence on Earth, but my friends, that's exactly what we have to do. Because in case you haven't noticed, welcome to the Anthropocene. We are now, all of us, living in a new geological era called the Anthropocene, and everything that you read about the Anthropocene is disastrous. We're destroying this, we're destroying that, we've destroyed 60% of all of the species, we continue to destroy. Is that our fate? I would say absolutely not. Because we've only just started the Anthropocene, and geological eras, as you remember, are actually long. We cannot continue that destruction throughout the entire geological era. It is our responsibility to hold the pen, because today human beings hold the pen like never before in the history of humankind. To hold the pen and to write the story of the Anthropocene as being the geological period in which humankind finally came to its ultimate responsibility. So my friends, here's the question that each of us has to answer in every action and every decision that we take today and over the next 10 years. Because here's the trick. If by 2030 we're not here instead of here, if we're not here, there is no way that we can actually get to the final destination. The next 10 years are the 10 years that decide the future of humanity and the future of this planet. And we're all alive and all co-responsible for the next 10 years. So here's the question. Every action that you take, every decision that you take, has to be preceded by this question. Does this action, this decision that I'm taking, contribute to humans and nature thriving together in the long term? If no, drop it. Don't even consider. If yes, full steam ahead. The only way. Thank you.
And now, let's hear it for Norwegian climate activist and member of the Children's Climate Panel, Penelope Lea.
When the Paris Agreement was signed during COP21, I had just turned 11. At the time, I had already been working with environmental issues for 3 years, starting when I was 8. My best friend, who's a bit older than me, was there in Paris, and I listened to her tell me all she could about it. Since then, I've attended 2 COPs myself. My best friend brought something back to me from Paris. This silk band. She took it from a tree outside the conference hall where hundreds of people had written their hopes, commitments, and fears. It says, "Every day counts." I choose to tell you this because I want you to remember that the generation you now see striking and fighting, building lawsuits against their own governments right now, have been listening to your discussions, reading up on science, hoping to comprehend the gap between the science report and the decision that has now been made for quite a long time now. As you know, what you do affects us, our future, and even more futures to come. But my point today is, it also affects and has affected our present and our childhood. I do not say this to make you feel bad. I tell you this because I think it's crucial to collaborate, generation to generation, countries to countries. And collaboration works best, I believe, if we acknowledge each other's positions, differences, abilities, and experience. I'm often asked, as I've been today, to say something about how it is to be young in the middle of the climate crisis. And as you know, speaking on behalf of millions of others is difficult, even impossible. But when it comes to being young in the middle of the climate crisis, I actually think I might be able to. To learn, at the age of 8, that everything, or at any other young age, that everything you love so hard that it hurts inside, life itself, is in danger, is an experience hard to put into words. And when you add the fact that you suddenly understand how the generation in charge, the one you have always trusted, and who will not be affected from the crisis themselves, have known this for a while, and have now the knowledge we need to solve the climate crisis, but despite this, do not act fast enough, is a feeling even harder to explain. You have heard it before, I know it, but please try to stay not only with the knowledge, but with the actually feeling, actually experience for a while. Being young today has to do about this feeling. And what we as young people can contribute with also has to do about this. System changes need huge changes of the way we think, the way we see ourselves, and the way we experience the world. There are many concepts that needs to get a new or wider meaning. One of them, I believe, is economic growth, even green growth. But another concept that already has and is changing its meaning is its truth. It's how the climate crisis are global, needing global solutions. And this concept as this concept has been used up to now, is still true, of course, so true actually, that it has been used as an excuse for countries like Norway not to act faster themselves by saying, we are too small, it doesn't matter what we do. Here, I have to add the fact that tiny, wealthy Norway is the 7th largest distributor of greenhouse gases. We still search for more oil, and even receiving the new IPCC Natural Panel report, we still search further north, risking coral reefs and some of the northernmost spawning grounds for cod. The climate crisis has created a new and global affiliation and commitment between youth all over the world. A deep and disturbing but shared experience that has in some cases made us feel closer to us than we do to our own governments. So when we say in Norway that we will not be hit as hard as others from the climate change, this, of course, is also true. But I do not really believe it. I do not feel it. It is not my truth. Here in Norway, and I know we are not the only country where this happens, the political parties most resistant to immigration are also the parties with the worst climate politics. This is hard for me to understand. Harder than a lot of the science I read. I believe the climate crisis has weakened our borders, our identity as countries, maybe not physical, but for many young people, emotional. And I believe this exact feeling, the widening of the concept global, is crucial to find and agree on the system changes we need. Maybe it sounds too simple. I've had meetings with politicians since I was 8, and I've heard the phrase, you have to remember, it is complicated, so many times. It is often used to stop action, to stop a conversation, and it smells a bit like giving up. But my generation will not be able to give up. We will not have that option. We are in this together. The fact that many young people give voices also to the simplicity of the facts in the climate crisis is not because we are naive or have too little knowledge. Keeping it simple is complicated. Keeping it simple is scary. Keeping it simple gives less room for excuses. Keeping it simple may help you find new solutions. And I believe keeping it simple is as necessary as seeing the complexity, not only to create new solutions, but also to put them in action. Because what am I to do when people I've organized with, made friends with, fighted as, felt the same fight and pain as, fighted together with, for climate action and justice, lose their drinking water, are caught in the middle of armed conflicts where resources or lack of resources are used as weapons? What am I to do when my friends lose their homes? Thank you.
Now we will have a conversation with our two last speakers and young climate leaders from across the world. This session will be led by the founder and CEO of Future Leaders, Elin Nørve.
Thank you, Penelope, for those inspiring and hopeful words. Dear Excellencies, I'm extremely excited to be here today. And even more so, I'm excited to welcome back on stage our chair for this event, Christiana Figueres, Penelope Leah, and also the young woman who will be the youth delegate to the UN Climate Summit later this September. So, I hope that you will all join me in welcoming them back on stage. great to have you here. Christiana, I would love to start with you. Over the last years, we've seen that youth, young voices, have been increasing, both become stronger and louder.
Thank God for that.
Thank God for that. Do you think this will have an impact on the climate debate?
I do think, but what I want to answer is, I don't think, I know. I know that it has already had quite an effect, because you see the references when people speak, when they write, when press or thought leaders, they are constantly referring. The youth has spoken with a sense of authority and credibility that is unflinching. And so when people speak or write, they are bound to reference the young people individually, or the climate strikes, or the youth movement. Since this started, I have not heard anyone who is any kind of a thought leader on climate speak or write, or the press, without a reference to the youth movement. And that's a remarkable achievement. Now, it's a good start, okay? Because I am sure that Penelope and all the rest of the young people don't aspire just to be reference points. They aspire to actually have an impact that goes beyond being mentioned and respected. So I think it's a good start that there's a reference point, and the next step has to be, and therefore, this is a decision that we are taking because we have understood. So I haven't seen the second part, but I'm seeing the first.
Penelope, you are one of these young voices, and you're one of the clearest speaking climate activists that we have here in Norway. And I know that you've been extremely excited to talk to Christiana and to ask her some questions. So I would actually like to give the word to you.
Thank you. You know, sometimes when I get scared or helpless, I have some tactics to get over it. And one of them is to watch some of your talks on YouTube.
Okay.
Your positivity and attitude really gets my spirit up. And I'm wondering, if you were 15 now, what would you have felt and what would you have done, do you think?
I don't think age has anything to do with it. If I were 15, or if I'm 63, which I am, I would be exactly the same person. And I'm grateful for the youth, what you're doing, but you're doing what all of us should have been doing. So I would be screaming in the streets, which I am anyway. But given the fact that I'm 63 and that I have access to people who do make decisions, I am, without asking for your permission, I am using your voice to, frankly, to put much more pressure than I have in the past. When I was working for the United Nations, I had to be a pretend diplomat, and was probably the least diplomatic of all diplomats ever. But I'm now even less diplomatic. Yesterday, I was at one of the largest oil and gas conferences in Aberdeen, Scotland. And they invited me to address the conference. And I delivered a seething address to this industry. The amazing reaction is how many of the oil and gas leaders came up and thanked me. And you know what, Penelope? They thanked me in the name of their children. How important is that, right? How important is that? Because I think one of the things that you have done is you have reminded us all that we're parents. We're at the table, we're taking decisions, you know? But before any of that, the most important role that we play on this planet is to be parents, or aunts, or uncles, or whatever our family relationship is. And when you can reach these people who are making the decisions who are not in your interest, when you can reach them personally, straight into their heart, into what is really, really important to them, which is the future of their children, they actually are capable of making very different decisions.
I am sad to tell everyone that unfortunately Christiana will have to leave us now due to a death in her nearest family. She will attend a funeral in Germany this afternoon, but she will join us again tomorrow, so we look forward to that. We wish you safe travels and welcome back tomorrow.
Thank you.
Now, Sophia, I would love to turn to you. Sophia will be the messenger from Oslo Pax to the UN Secretary General, and we are very pleased to have you here. First, I am very curious, why is it important that young people are listened to all the way to the top of the UN building?
So you could say, like, yeah, it's proper that half of the world is represented. But I don't think that's the main reason. I think it's important that young people are listened to because we have some good solutions. And every person can just tell their own reality. And we need all of those realities to find the best solutions. And we don't only need young people, we need old people. And we need adults. And we need all of these to tell us all the different stories and really bring the solutions to the table, because we are heading for a crisis and we know it. So we don't have time to, just talk about some solutions from one part of the population.
When you represent us in the UN in September, there's going to be a lot of young voices from all over the world. And we all agree that we need to act both individually and as one. So what responsibility do we have as individuals, as nations, and as a global society?
I believe we as individuals have the responsibility to raise our voices when we see a system that works against our morale. Because in my everyday life, I feel like I need to make choices between my morale and the system's easy choices. And we have a responsibility to tell our stories. And we do strike, and we do say that this is a system that doesn't work with our morale. And then the politicians also have an important responsibility to take this serious, because they need to provide the opportunity for us to actually work with our morale. We know what choices we want to take, but it's very hard when, just taking a train to Bergen is 4 times the price and 4 times the time. So it's hard to actually do what we would want to do in the first place when we have a system that really, really works against what we need to do to create the future we want. And then, of course, we have a global framework for working with climate change. We have the Paris Agreement, and it urges us to act. But we all know that the Paris Agreement won't be anything without the nations really acting. So we need nations pushing each other to create climate justice, both to be transparent, to provide finance, to really cut emission. And we can't just wait for the others to take the lead. Like, there is no nation in the world doing what they should do in this time. And yeah, maybe this is also an urge for Norway to act, to really act, because we have, a huge amount of money from the oil industry. So maybe, taking this global responsibility and act on behalf of the majority of the world and not just for our own interests. I think if the world was a real democracy, we wouldn't be chosen as the leaders.
Thank you for your input and thoughts. Now, as you all know, Oslo Pax is an international conference. It is also a climate-friendly conference. Therefore, we are lucky to be joined on video, very trendy, all the way from India and New Delhi. From the offices of the NGO, BBA, founded by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and this is what I've been working on all day, let me tell you, Kailash Satyarthi. We are here joined by Arman Sharma. And hello, Arman, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, all good. As a young climate activist in India, we are excited to hear your thoughts. What is the most important message you have to Oslo Pax and the UN?
Good morning, I'm Aman Sharma, and I'm studying modern school in New Delhi. And I'm really happy to be representing India at the Oslo Pax. I'm sure you've all heard of New Delhi till now, India's capital city. How many of you know that it is also the world's most polluted capital city? My home and my city is set to join the list of Indian cities to have no groundwater by 2020. That means that my fellow citizens and I are going to be stripped of our natural water resources in just about 120 days. And we say that the government and the corporations are to blame. We as citizens didn't do anything to induce this crisis. But perhaps that's where we went so terribly wrong. We didn't do anything. Not to save our planet, not to save our burning home. And that silence proved to be our greatest threat. You see, I feel petrified thinking what will happen to my household in January 2020 when we have no water. But I know that I'll make it due to me holding a certain position of privilege in society. But what about those who have so little and who come from the weaker sections of society? Those who work day and night for the facilities that we take for granted each day. And how can we, in our ignorance, think that it's okay to use up their carbon budgets? How can we let them live without a basic amenity like drinking water? So the climate crisis is not an elitist crisis. It is a human rights crisis. People are being denied their right to clean water and to clean air. The poor in my country have to walk kilometers just to fill a single bucket of water from a dying hand pump in a far-off village. And yet, we have sugar-coated the truth, ridiculed the facts, and stifled the figures. We've supported policies that degrade our home and increase the gap between the poor and the rich, the haves and the have-nots. My country has high levels of poverty and inequality. 73% of the wealth generated in 2017 went to the richest 1% in India. 600 million people are at risk from the water crisis, and 700 million people from air pollution. I have lost 3 to 5 years of my life to air pollution, and India has lost 8.5% of its GDP to the same problem. In short, I think that children are being forced to pay for the wrongs of our past generations. And we've unthinkingly allowed companies and policies to sell our future for their profit. And in the process, also given them access to the people who are dependent on us. And I just feel that as a child, I would like to say the policymakers that we don't care for your empty promises or your deceitful words. But as children, we want your work and your actions to speak. You are scared to admit the truth, and you're scared of what people will think and what they will say, what the rich will say. But we don't want that. You look for money when you look at our planet, but we look for love and we look for life. If little children like me can understand how grave the situation is, I find it funny that adults cannot. And over here, I think I'm not going to state any solutions because we have the science, we have the figures and the facts that we need. But I feel we still lack the basic compassion, the mindset, and the will to go with them. And it is shameful. It is shameful that children are having to tell people how to save the planet, beg their leaders to secure their future, and miss school to educate them on this crisis. I think we have to refuse to live in a world which is governed by a principle that gives murder justification through economic profit. And we need to refuse to live in a society where fossil fuels and coal plants are worth more than my life, my planet, and my future. And where microplastics are plastering my inside, and my share of the ozone layer has long gone before I could even get to it. I think everyone watching this needs to fight for the future of this planet. We need to fight for our rights, fight for the voiceless, fight for your nation. This is your planet. You don't have a second home that you can go for. This is our only chance, and this is the only place that we can inhabit as a community and as a society. So please step up, rise up to the challenge, and save your planet. I would just like to pose a question to the panel. You know, we have a lot of climate summits happening regularly. Even in my country, in several countries, they run simultaneously. But we have still not been able to achieve the full vigor and the groundwork that we need from the resolutions that are passed. So how can we as a summit at the Oslo Pax aim to change that and really make a difference with what we talk of and what we decide today?
Thank you so much, Karman.
Thank you.
We are certainly glad to see that you are doing your part, and we're going to try our best to keep our part of the same promise. Now, I am excited to tell you that we're also joined from Nairobi in Kenya, where we have a young man who leads a youth group in the slum area, Mathare. Isaac Musa, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Good. We're excited to hear what we can learn from your experience in the work you've done in Mathare.
Okay, I'm ready to share. Okay, first of all, greetings from Nairobi. My name is Isaac Mutisia Mwasa, but I'm known as Kaka. Kaka means brother in my community. And thank you for the opportunity to share my experience at the first Oslo Pax Summit. The country and the people of Norway are dear to my heart as they have supported our project in one of the largest slums in Africa, where I am from. I look forward to sharing my story a little in the program, but for now, I would like to briefly talk about the importance of youth inclusion in processes such as this and overall community building. First, as young people working with other young people, we must incorporate a do no harm approach to our work. It's also important to remember as youth leaders, that is our responsibility to help other youth overcome barriers to participate for meaningful engagement and lasting results. Many in this room today are privileged, and I'm also privileged to help my youth overcome barriers. We must always ask ourselves, who is in this room? Who's around the room? And who's missing from the room? You must be in the room to negotiate around the table, to influence negotiations, and supported outside the room to build alliances, to collaborate with other stakeholders and partners. I look forward to elaborate more on my work at the Mathare Environmental Conservation Youth Center. Thank you.
Now, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We look forward to hear more and learn more over the coming hours of the conference. Now, I'm sad to tell you that this panel is closing up. But luckily, we are being joined by all these young voices later in the conference. I want to sincerely thank all of you for your contribution and to give us all hope for tomorrow. It is pretty clear that the young voices matter, and by what we've heard here, I think we can all agree that it's pretty certain that they will keep the fight going. So thank you very much. Now I'm excited to tell you that there's going to be a coffee break, so enjoy.
ما جيرين ما الله بان أقيلي روب حق الروب نمضة يمكن نولانيني روب كي أبارس كسر راين نقطعي جوبان بيوحكود ديان بان نيجري جوبان كاني مناينا أبليل بانقوي مناي أبليل كنا وانا قايس كبابا أينو.
Everybody wants to cut, ban, and think about what they can get today. But nobody is looking forward and saying what will happen in the next 20 years.
Charcoal production induces desertification and deforestation. The kids that are farmers will lose their jobs, and because they lose their jobs, they become radical. That is the conflict-environment nexus.
waxaan samayn jiray saxmad baan lahaa kalluunka iyo argostada iyo libaaxa gurin jiray anagoo kalluunka iyo libaaxa ka shaqaysanaba waxaan lagu dhacday baraakiib badda ka timi oo dowlad kasta leh wixii shaqaalihii iyo jilibkii iyo qaabkii naga qaadatay ترى waxaan caalamka dhan baan u sheegnay badan baan u sheegnay markii wax laga qaban waayay waxaan u aragnay wax de anagu gacanteeda ma cid kale wax naga qaban karin anagu de wasixmadaan wax haysanay badaasan aadnay difaaci
macnaha waxa weeyaan waxaan rajeynay waxaan filayaa inaan nololba inaan jirin haddii ay taasi ila muuqato aniga Soomaaliya ama macnaha Afrikaba
laakiin badii eba ay khasarada meesha ku jirta iyo dadkii iyo dhibta ka socota dadkii kaari oo ka haralaabaan ku jira meesha taasi waxa weeye waa fududahay waa ka soo fududanaya maalin waxba la helaa maalin waxba la waayaa mal baa shidaal kugu go'aya nasiibka calaf markaas ma laga wala helaa ما مال أو دجال أي كسر حتى قرر مال أي كأركان يعني يصير أنقب أو كلا مال قرر أي كأركان أما سين دجال أما التشكيل أو كلا هنا يكون قرارات مريبي ساس أي تاي أنا واحد تكنن مكان جالن
My conviction and my belief is the security of this country, the existence of the people, of the Somali people, is entirely dependent on what happens in the natural resources. If we don't intervene as quickly as possible, we should expect more wars, we should expect more conflicts, and we should expect more terrorists who can recruit those desperate young boys. The question is, what can we do? Is it possible to intervene? And my answer is yes.
Because we are human and we are alive, we are thinking beings. And it's not in our nature, I think, to give up. Nobody likes to die sitting, yeah?
Dear guests, welcome to Session 1, Climate Change and Conflict. The introduction will be held by the President of the Norwegian Red Cross, former Inspector General of the Norwegian Army, and head of several UN missions, Robert Mood.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. We live in a world that, for the moment, seems dominated by bad news when it comes to climate. Ice melting in Greenland, record-setting fires from the Arctic to the Amazon, summer heat waves, and all kinds of weather-related records falling, drought and flooding. There's a growing number of reports concerning how man has changed nature as well as climate itself. And man is the ever-present factor when we discuss the causes of climate change and who suffers the consequences. National Red Cross and Red Crescent Society volunteers are in every community, reaching around 160 million people annually through long-term services and development programs, as well as 110 million people through disaster response and early recovery programs. Our volunteers have long since seen and experienced the grim reality of climate change. When we say that climate change will bring more extreme weather, droughts that last longer, crops that are ruined, rain seasons that occur unexpectedly or not at all, our volunteers know that devastating impact on people is the common denominator. On young families, on elders, on children, on women, and men of all ages. In June, the Norwegian Red Cross launched a report on the humanitarian consequences of climate change experiences in our international work in a 10-year perspective. The evidence is as overwhelming as it is daunting. Climate change has severe negative impacts on crops, water quality and livelihoods, and it can and it does aggravate existing larger scale conflicts. When discussing the impacts of climate-related disasters on international peace and security, we must acknowledge to what extent climate change can multiply people's vulnerability in situations of armed conflict. Overall, Africa and Asia are expected to be the most vulnerable regions in terms of humanitarian consequences of climate change. More than 40% of the countries experiencing a food crisis in 2017 faced the double burden of climatic shocks and conflict. In a short-term perspective, we have not found evidence that climate change causes large-scale armed conflicts directly, but it is confirmed that it aggravates and it prolongs existing conflicts. This year, the conflict in Syria entered its 9th year, but protracted conflicts are not a new phenomenon. The international community of the Red Cross, ICRC, has worked to protect and assist those affected by armed conflicts in Afghanistan for more than 30 years, South Sudan for more than 40 years, contexts which are not unique in the way that access to the affected populations is challenging, and security concerns make it difficult for development actors to be present and provide needed services. What is new? What is new is that climate change make the direct and indirect humanitarian consequences of armed conflict even worse. And furthermore, that climate change will negatively impact the possibilities to end the conflicts. Climate change has forced us to work differently. Today, there are approximately 400 extreme weather events every year, which is 4 times as many as during the 1970s. 4 times as many as during the 1970s. In addition to the emergency aid we offer in areas of war and conflict, the Red Cross were responsible for 111 emergency aid operations worldwide in 2017, reaching a record of 8 million people. More than half of these emergency aid operations were established as a result of extreme weather events. In such cases, we deliver food and water, we ensure primary health services, we search for people who are buried under dirt, rubble, and collapsed buildings. We help reconnect families who have lost track of each other, and we take care of people who suffer mentally after trauma and crisis. So the double impact of climate shocks and armed conflict harm people's ability to cope. It exacerbates vulnerabilities and inequalities, especially in situations of armed conflicts where countries, communities, and populations are least prepared to protect themselves and to adapt. Drought in Australia is not the same as in Sahel. In Sahel, armed conflict, deepening poverty, weakening public services, and disruption of traditional means of survival are not only due to conflict, but also because of diminishing usable land and unpredictable water supply. Communities facing dual challenges are disproportionately affected. They often face growing risks of flood or drought and are forced to look for new livelihoods, to move on, change their lifestyle, or simply move away from their homes to the unknown. We also know that in armed conflict, nature habitats as well as civilian infrastructure is often harmed or destroyed, which may in turn have environmental consequences contributing to climate change. When preparing for this introductory remarks, I explored new words to express what is in front of our eyes, to find new ways to talk about an issue that seems almost frighteningly familiar. I wanted surprising approaches to communicate what we already know. I felt I did not have the words to describe the multitude of the dramatic events we are witnessing. Then I realized there is nothing wrong with the words we are already using. They describe perfectly well what is going on. They are words like destruction, famine, distress, damage, The question is, though, if we allow ourselves to fully take in the meaning of these words. Do we realize what it means that climate change will harm most those who are already subject to poverty, conflict, and violence? If we fail, the consequences will be greater humanitarian suffering and larger humanitarian needs than we can ever cope with, no matter the response. So, the world is dominated by bad news on climate, but also about a rising awareness and commitment to make the necessary changes to preserve a healthy environment for future generations. The necessary shift in mentality, our basic approach to nature and climate, is changing. It is not too late. This is the beginning. In the Red Cross, through the efforts of our volunteers, we see what difference people can make to others. That source of strength is going to be fundamental when facing the challenges ahead of mankind. I have heard some say that humanitarians don't do climate. Well, my friends, I've got news for you. We do climate every day. We do the consequences of climate change every day. This is a cause bigger than all of us, but still not too big if we travel this journey together, as we should. And you know, the youngsters are right. It is not that difficult. It's all about will. Thank you.
Please give a warm welcome to the Secretary General of the Nobel Peace Prize winning organization Amnesty International, Kumi Naidu.
Thank you. Excellencies, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me start with a confession that these days when I stand up and speak, I'm much more afraid and fearful than I was as a 15-year-old activist in apartheid South Africa because, and I'll tell it to you in a story, as speaking in the United States a year ago, I was looking at where the world was, and at the end of my speech, a very troubled woman put up her hand and said, "Dr. Naidu, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, yes, he inspired me as a young activist. He said, do you know what his most famous speech was called? And thinking it was a trick question, I said very gently, I have a dream. And she shouted back at me. She said, yes, it was I have a dream. But when I hear you speak, it sounds as you have a nightmare. Everything is collapsing and so on. So the challenge of leadership in the moment that we find ourselves is finding the right balance to speak truth to power, not sanitize how serious things are, but on the other hand, to do it in a way that does not demotivate, depress, and immobilize people. We have to get the kind of leadership right now, which young people are the only ones offering it, might I say, of finding that right balance between hope and courage in terms of calling it as it is. And let's remind ourselves that Martin Luther King was also a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And I want to just share a wisdom that he said in 1965 that I think might be an important contribution to the moment that we find ourselves. He was speaking in 1965 when I was about 4 months old. And he said, my friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so immoral and unjust that good, decent people should refuse to adjust to. He then went on to say, I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination, the mindless expenditure on military weapons when people don't have food to eat, and importantly on the economy, he said, I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. If he was talking about the US in 1965, it's 1,000 times more relevant to the US today as it is to every country around the world. And let's be clear, the biggest driver of climate change is a broken, unjust economic system. Let's be clear about it. All of us are pussyfooting around the problem, but unless we start talking, and you know, young people get it. I was with the young people in London, marching with them. I can tell you their slogans are much better than the communications departments of Statoil or even Amnesty International, right? As we walked past Downing Street, you know, where the cabinet meets, 2 14-year-olds picked up a sign saying, "You can get better cabinets at IKEA." 2 12-year-olds pick up a sign saying, "Keep Earth clean. It's not Uranus." Okay, that didn't work here either. I tried it in Germany, it didn't work, but it's true, they did carry such a sign. But let me just say that this is not a time for exceptional depression and frustration. This has to be a time of creativity and innovation. And let me just say that people like me have said many times, save the planet, save the environment, save the climate for like 30 years now. I want to share some good news with you, seeing that I've also contributed to depressing you. The planet is fine. The planet actually does not really need saving. Because if we continue on the way that we are, what will be the end result? We warm the planet up to the point where we don't have water, we don't have food, we cannot survive the heat. The end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. Good news is, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So don't worry about the planet. Understand that the fight that we are in is nothing more and nothing less about whether we are committed to protecting our children and their children's future. The fight that we're in is whether, in fact, we have a sense of intergenerational justice, that we as adults in this moment have to govern and lead in a way that we have a self-conscious knowledge that there are children and grandchildren coming after us. The kind of leadership we have right now, by the way, I am convinced that Trump, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Modi in India, Duterte in Philippines, Orban in Hungary, all on the same WhatsApp list moderated by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, where you're looking at strategies to hold us back on democracy, on climate change, and a whole bunch of things. Right? And we need to understand where power is being manipulated. So in 2002, now, okay, the next sentence, let me just make a confession. The next sentence I'm about to say is not a sentence I say often. Okay, and some of you might be surprised. It goes like this. I fully support the CIA and the Pentagon. When in 2002, they handed a report to George W. Bush, which said that our reading is that in the coming decades, the biggest threat to peace, security, and stability will not come from conventional threats, will not come from terrorism, but will come from the impacts of climate change. The CIA, for example, for more than 2.5 decades has had a specialist unit looking at the impacts of climate change on peace, stability, and so on. Of course, George W. Bush, being a climate denialist, buried the report, and we never saw it, and no action was taken. By the way, just an aside, you remember those days where we thought George W. Bush was a disaster? We'll have him back right now, won't we? So, and if you go a little bit further back, President Eisenhower, when he was stepping down from office, he said, I want to warn you, as I step down from office, about the power of what he called the military-industrial complex. He said we run the risk of getting to a point where we will actually have our societies driven by an economy that's driven by military interests. By military interests, he also meant the rapacious greed of military companies who are going to try, for them to survive, they need war. I mean, let's be blunt. If you want to promote a military industry, and if there's no war, it's a very bad thing, no? Because then you don't have a market for your goods. I would say that what we're dealing with is a military-industrial fossil fuel complex, which we need to. As for Amnesty, you might be wondering how we come to climate change. Amnesty, one of the things we did when it was very unpopular years ago, decades ago, was take on the issue of death penalty. When majority of countries in the world have death penalty. Right now, a minority of countries in the world have death penalty thanks to the work of Amnesty. Today, climate change constitutes a mass death penalty on the entire population of our planet. And that is why we as a human rights organization have no hesitation in saying that we will continue to contribute to climate change. All our existing work, right to food, right to water, indigenous people's rights, migration rights, refugee rights, all of these issues, which we have been working on historically, have a massive climate component to it. I want to say one thing quickly. Running out of time. Not every intervention that we will make to respond to the energy crisis and to climate change will always be good. So all the people driving electric motor vehicles in Oslo, for example, I was one of the people who got stuck, they ran out of battery last night at 11 o'clock coming here. You might feel good, oh, I'm doing the right thing, I'm now cleaned up my footprint. But those batteries that are there are coming from the worst exploitation of cobalt in Democratic Republic of Congo. Right? So, or for the matter in Oaxaca, Mexico, where indigenous people's lands were basically stolen from them and a big concentrated solar and wind facility was put. What we are saying is we need to make sure that even the renewable energy interventions that are made will be aligned to human rights. Let me end, I'm out of time, with a message to the young people. So I love that last panel. The only thing I didn't like about the last panel was this term, future leaders. So I want to say to young people of my generation are very good at saying young people are the leaders of tomorrow. Folks, if young people wait for tomorrow, there's not going to be a tomorrow for you to take leadership in. Right? Please take the leadership now, because let me humbly admit that my generation has run out of fresh ideas. The climate movement needs fresh ideas, and it's only going to come from young people, as they've shown eloquently in the last year. And I'm very pleased to say that the Fridays for the Future movement, in Norway, and Greta Thunberg, and about 20 countries where the movement is alive and well, on the 16th of September and around there, we'll be giving Amnesty's highest award, called the Ambassador of Conscience Award, to these young people to help lift up their voices. And I hope that all of you here will stand up and support the 20th September climate strike to say that we stand with our children. Thank you very much.
Dear guests, the panel discussion on climate change and conflict will be led by Director of Cicero Center for International Climate Research, Kristin Halvorsen.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this extremely important event. And I'm looking forward to this panel discussion that will last for around 45 minutes, and we will dig deeper into the topic on climate change and security. I have a wonderful panel with me. They are extremely competent. They have military background. They have backgrounds from everywhere. And my goal is that we are a bit wiser after 45 minutes with these 5 people than we were before they came. And we are going to find some solutions to the nightmare. So please join me, Robert Mood, Kumi Naidu, Mali Mjobjerg, Tom Middeldorp, Halvard Buhaug. Please. I think I just have to wave to you. I think we'll start by giving the new people on the stage a couple of minutes to comment on the introductions from Robert and Kumi. So please, Malin, I'll give you a very brief introduction. You are a senior researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and the director of the Climate Change and Risk Program, and currently leading the project Climate Change and Security. So she's an expert, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you also for inviting me to this important conference. I think, first of all, since I work on the security side and more related to peace and security issues linked to climate change, what you highlighted here is really where I think one has to start with. The primary consequences of climate change are linked to humanitarian crisis. And then one part of those are also linked to violent conflict. But the predominant challenges are linked to our human livelihood conditions and challenges human will face today and also in the future. Entering towards this more previously, or I think still, very debated field, how to understand climate change specifically linked to violent conflict. There has been a tendency, particularly in media, I think, because media extract some tendencies to polarize the debate about how climate change more or less deterministically will impact violent conflict, which is not true. Violent conflicts are always parts of human actions and activities, and climate change impacts a lot of intermediating factors, which of course impacts violent conflict as well, about livelihood conditions, about the possibility to where to live and how the mobility patterns change and whether you are able to negotiate your ability to stay in a new area. So what I think is a key challenge in order to make clever argument and really refine the conversation about climate change also to violent conflict is to emphasize and focus on to explore these much more fine-grained pathways which make the story from climate change as a systemic change to unique outcomes of violent conflict. And when we have focus on this, I will just describe how some of these pathways, what they are looking like, because they are also very, very different, which speaks to also how it's possible to respond to them. When we have looked into these pathways, and specifically here we are in regions such as in Kenya or Sudan or South Sudan, and in that context, because this is always context-specific, it is about undermining how climate change undermines the livelihood conditions, how it undermines the ability for the access of natural resources, the pressure on livelihood, the loss of income, whether it is from pastoralism or agriculture. And this processes, particularly in natural resource dependency countries, where it's more predominantly, where it directly has this kind of impacts. Another pathway links rather over how changing mobility patterns for pastoral communities and also the lack of shared conflict resolutions or agreements, or where you have access to be, where you are received as a possibility to host your cattle. These are both about more or less reason or causes behind the conflict sides. But we can also see, and I think this is a very important difference to make, how already current conflicts also are impacted by more or less weather events. When it's most opportune? When it's most opportune to steal cattle? Where conflicts occurs around well areas? And I think that difference is really crucial to focus more on, because that leads also over how people can respond and tailor responses. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Tom Middendorp, you're from the Planetary Security Initiative, and you are the previous Chief of Defense in the Netherlands and the Netherlands Special Envoy on European Defense Cooperation. And that means you have many years of experience from the military sector. And could you reflect on, is there an increased attention in the military sector when it comes to climate change and extreme events? Please.
Well, absolutely. I've been in the military for 40 years, and I raised the issue of climate change and the security effects, especially of it, of which I'm very concerned, several years ago. In the Halifax conferences, in the Planetary Security Conference, and it gave screaming headlines in the Netherlands. What was this general interfering with? It was an environmental issue, not a military issue.
So then it was
so
a
lot of
controversial
debates.
topic. Yeah, you shouldn't, interfere with that hot political topic. Was that
very stovepiped discussion back then?
Yeah.
And it even triggered enormous parliamentary debate in the Netherlands. But in the end, everybody had to acknowledge that it made sense, that there is a security dimension to climate change. And I became known as the Green General, which I take as a compliment. But what I would like to tell you is that listening to all these previous introductions, I can only conclude that we are underestimating the challenge that we are facing and that we are under-delivering the solutions. And a famous Frenchman once said, Clemenceau, that wars are too important to be left to generals. I would like to paraphrase him. I think climate change is too important to be left to environmental ministers. And as a military, I've experienced many, many times how access to natural resources can be a reason for war. How shortage of resources can be a reason for war. And I brought 2 slides. And the first one depicts how the trends that have been explained this morning, how they affect each other and how they reinforce each other. You see the fragility of countries, you see the population growth in many countries, you see the water stress depicted geographically and the floodings, the risk of floodings. And if you lay them over each other, you see that these are the same countries that are being affected multiple times. And a month ago, we had the Earth Overshoot Day, meaning that from that point on, we were consuming more than the Earth could deliver and produce in a year. So we are now eating away and drinking away and using away 1.5 Earth every year. And that moment, that overshoot moment, is moving backwards in time. So it's only increasing the problem. And if you add to that our world population is going to increase with 1/3 in the coming decades, you can only imagine that this problem will become larger instead of smaller, which gives me an enormous sense of urgency. And that sense of urgency I heard in the different discussions this morning as well. And this slide also shows that large parts of the world will become inhabitable, and climate change is happening at this moment, whatever we do. The only thing we can do is slow it down and make sure that the consequences don't become bigger as they are already becoming. And that means that we need to speed up. So we need to fold that paper that was shown here earlier together, and we need to do that together. So to me, it's very clear that climate change is a threat multiplier, and that we are facing an existential challenge that requires not an environmental approach, but a whole of society approach from all departments. It should be on the agenda of every minister, in every cabinet, in every country. And they should look at their responsibilities. What can I bring to the table to help solve this? And what I would like to do here today, and that brings me to my second and last slide, is not add another call for action. What I would like to do here today is offer help. I'm a chairman of a newly established International Military Council on Climate and Security. And it's a deliverable of the last Planetary Security Conference. And what we do is we create 3 networks, and we want to make those networks global. And one network is a network of experts from the security sector. Recently retired, still fresh in mind, military like I am, because I haven't given up the current generation yet. A second tier is the government representatives, not making it political, so members from government, which gives us access and can feed the different departments in countries so that they can build their policies. And the third layer is research institutes. And we already have almost 20 research institutes worldwide, in Europe, in Africa, connected to this network. And we just started 3 months ago, so it's very new. And I believe this can be another, like there are already powerful movements on this planet, but this is a powerful movement from the security sector. What we can help do is put the security dimension of climate change on the agenda. Go more into depth into what are the effects of climate change or related to security and what can we do about it. And I think that the defense organizations, the security organizations have a lot to bring to the table. What we can help do is predict. We have enormous intelligence organizations. And they are very good. An example was just being given by Robert Mood and by you, I believe, that the CIA already predicted the effects of climate change decades ago. So there is an enormous analytic capability in every military looking at roots of conflict. This is a root of conflict. This is the biggest change we are facing. So focus a part of that energy on this problem and help us to create an early warning system so that we can anticipate on changes and anticipate on events to come. Another thing that the military can do is support adaptation and protection of civil critical infrastructure. We can embrace energy transition. The defense organizations in the world are, in most countries, the biggest fossil fuel consumer.
Yes.
So they have a responsibility, and they can be part of that solution. They need to be part of that solution, but they don't all see that. I think they can also help and should address the effects of climate change as a risk multiplier. They will be faced with these effects, and they should help set up mechanisms to support disaster relief operations. We had a big hurricane in St. Martin in the Caribbean. And what struck me is that all countries and all islands were very stovepiped in their help. So the Netherlands was helping St. Martin, France was helping their part of the island, and the UK was helping another island, and all next to each other. Why not create more integrated regional support mechanisms? So I think there are a lot of those very practical solutions that we can bring to the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And new organizations are actually established to be part of the solution. So that is really encouraging, I think. And just for the rest of the discussion, let's all remember that reducing emission is our main topic. Then we can, avoid the worst effects of climate warming. But today we are going to concentrate more on how we can work together. And Halvard Buhauge, he is a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And he leads and he has directed a number of research projects on security dimensions of climate change. And he is here because of a hurricane. Because Katharina Mack, she is a colleague of you. You are working together on this topic. And she is stuck in Miami due to the Hurricane Dorian. And the scientists at CISRO and those who are working on hurricanes, they tell me that hurricane will not appear more frequently, but they will be much stronger. And there will be more damage connected to hurricanes because of global warming. So we are actually inviting you here because of a hurricane, and that is very closely connected to global warming. But I would like you to dig a bit deeper into this. What do we mean by climate change and a threat multiplier? Because it's a lot of different reasons behind conflicts. And there is often, as we've heard, both from Malin and from Tom, a climate dimension connected to each and every one of them. So please.
Thanks, Christian. Let me start by just thanking the organizers for inviting me to come here on a short notice. It's sad that my good colleague and friend, Katharina Mack, couldn't be here for rather ironic reasons. Apparently she was evacuated from her house in Miami. I hope everything's fine. Threat multiplier. It's a term that we've heard many times today, many times before. And it's a term that I think can be very useful if we apply it in the correct manner or in a reasonable manner. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think one of the insightful aspects of the term threat multiplier is the insight that climate in and of itself, or climate change and climatic events in and of themselves, may not necessarily have a profound impact on conflict risk. And I think Malin also alluded to this lack of deterministic link between the environment and conflict. But it could add to already existing stressors and vulnerability in societies, and thereby increase conflict risk in societies that already suffer from a number of factors that we know are associated with a high conflict risk, such as poverty, inequality, poor governance, displacement, food insecurity, and other factors. All of those factors are sensitive to climate change. And so looking forward, there are good reasons to be worried also about the security implications of climate change, because we know that climate change has the potential to severely affect these key drivers of conflict. And I also think that Robert Mood's talk just a few minutes ago was very instructive in the sense of pointing to how climatic events and extremes contribute to make ongoing conflicts worse, increasing violence and escalation, increasing displacement, etc. And so if you already have a society suffering from conflict, suffering from instability, and a climatic extreme event occurs, the consequences of that conflict is likely to get worse. Yet there is one additional dimension of this nexus between the climate and conflict that I would like to highlight. And that's the reverse link from conflict onto the environment, or to be more precise, from conflict to environmental vulnerability. And I'm sure that Robert Mood can testify to this. Many of the humanitarian crises that we see today around the world are sites of conflict, and then a drought or a flood or some other extreme event occurs, right? So conflict makes societies and populations and individuals more vulnerable to extreme weather events, and therefore also make the consequences of those events more severe. And I also believe the Nobel laureate this morning alluded to the military power that we have and the potential for destroying the world many times over. And I think that's a very correct observation and a very worrying observation. And in order to address climate change, in order to mitigate as much as we can climate change, and also in order to adapt to whatever climate change we cannot get rid of, we need peace.
Yes.
So that would be my key take on the threat multiplier terminology.
Yeah, it's easy. It sounds easy. We need peace to deal with all these problems. But maybe we should dig into some more concrete examples. Do we have some examples? And when I'm thinking of the Netherlands is one country that is, almost drowning because of climate change. But it is also democracy. It's good governance. They manage. So it's a perfect example on how it's possible to manage if the other factors are, functioning. But maybe you have some concrete examples of conflicts and extreme events, climate change. Tom?
Yeah, well, the Netherlands, the oldest enemy the Netherlands is facing is the sea.
Yeah.
So we've been fighting that for centuries.
Yeah.
And it's a whole of society fight. Every citizen in the Netherlands is involved in that because 1/3 of our population lives below the sea level. So imagine what happens if this protection fails. And we have seen that happen in the 50s. So we set up a whole new delta work mechanism to protect ourselves against the sea. But these delta works are only able to protect us against 60, 70 centimeters of sea level rise. The predictions are 1.5, 2 meters this century. So imagine the effect on a country like ours. And we have the luxury that we can take measures to protect ourselves. Many countries in the world don't have that luxury. They also live in delta areas. So I think this will have a dramatic effect on many countries. More than half of the populations live in cities. Where are cities located? Coastal areas and rivers. And that's exactly where the floodings will occur. So it will affect more than half of the population in the world, I'm afraid. Miami City is at the risk of being flooded. It's at sea level. Norfolk, the biggest military base in the world, is at sea level, is at risk of being flooded. So we need to adapt. And adaptation is something that the Netherlands have been dealing with over centuries. And we are already taking measures to protect ourselves from things that will occur this century. And I think that adaptation is what we need to see happening all over the world.
But it is actually a very good example on this multiply effect, the other way around, because it's a democracy, it's well-governed, you manage. So it's all these layers that makes it complicated. But is it, Robert, could you say that the conflict, the war in Syria is closely connected to lack of water and lack of food?
Yeah, it's a very good point, because as you heard, I made the point that we do not see wars that is caused by climate change. But when we went into Syria in 2012 and tried to do something to get it onto a political track, we already then had analysts who argued that the demographic changes that had happened in Haleb, in Damascus, in Dara, in the big cities, because of the droughts that had been severe the years before, had changed the demographics, like I said, in these cities so much that that was part of the reason to destabilize the Syrian society at a pace where it then span out of control. So there were those who argued already then that climate change, the causes of climate change were a big part of what happened in between the Arab Spring and the collapse in Syria. Could I make one point related to that? Because there's two arguments you are hearing, both on the international scene and in the national scene. It's the argument when you say climate change and nature destruction needs to be at the top of any list when you are making decisions or when you're planning whatever. And then you always hear, well, what about all the other good causes? What about healthcare? What about schools? It's this what about argument that kind of makes the climate dimension smaller. And it's also for rich countries. The rich countries, they say, we will do our part. Well, the we will do our part is almost a code for not doing what is enough.
So they should say we should do more than our part?
Absolutely. Yes. Take Norway. We argue, every Norwegians in the room know that we have now lived in several years where we argue our production is very clean. So we should produce more oil and gas. Well, where they burn our oil and gas, it's not cleaner than anyone else's. So all the money, all the competence, all the technological advantages we have gained as rich countries from this industry should, of course, be used to set a good example on the global scene. We have an extra responsibility. Take it, move with it.
Yeah. Yes, I don't think you disagree with that.
I 1000% agree with everything Robert said. You see, maybe there's something about military in me, because CIA, Pentagon, and now and the Green General. So basically, okay, let me just use this opportunity to make a challenge to Norway, right?
Mm-hmm. Please.
Bottom line is, Norway and Europe, right, have built the economies historically on decimating forests, decimating nature in many parts, and the use of fossil fuels. At that time, we didn't know that fossil fuels cause damage, so therefore nobody should be held sort of guilty for something that we didn't know. But in 1992, when the Earth Summit took place in Rio, when climate change was recognized by the United Nations, and George W. Bush Sr. was there waving his finger saying, the American way of life is non-negotiable, when that was the attitude of the countries that built them. So the difficulty for us in Africa and other developing countries, it's so difficult for us to say to our leaders, please leave the oil in the ground, leave the coal in the ground, and so on. And they say to us, those rich people from Europe, they built the economies on that, and they're continuing to come up with things such as clean oil and clean coal and so on. So it's a really, and what we say to them is, listen, you can't bury your head in the sand. The people that are paying the first and most brutal impacts of climate change are actually people in our parts of the world, even though we have contributed little to the problem. So, and I think we must be honest here, right? Because I do think we are suffering from a major psychological problem as humanity, and that is a problem that you could describe as cognitive dissonance, where all the facts are there, right, that we have to move in a way, but it's too inconvenient to do that based on short-term comfort zones. And unless we actually break through cognitive dissonance, we don't have a chance. And I think Martin Luther King, sorry, I'll go back to him. When the longer version of the speech, he put a challenge, and he said, I call on decent men and women around the world to come together and set up a new global movement to be known as the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment, right? The young people, for me, are the only people that are actually rising up to that challenge decades after what he said. Because basically they're saying the status quo is, I mean, Christiana, who knows better than most of us because she's been in the center of the science. I mean, basically, if you just listen to what she said, she's basically saying, okay, if I was in a different conference, I might have used a different word. She's saying we're basically screwed, right? That's what she's saying. And the difference with climate change compared to, say, gender equality. Gender equality, quickly, we've been fighting for gender equality for a long time. It's pathetic how limited progress we've made. However, with gender equality, there isn't a clock that's ticking to say, you've got to sort it out in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. With climate change, there is a clock that's ticking, and the scientists are telling us, every month you waste, every quarter you waste, every year you waste, you're getting deeper and deeper. As in South Africa would say, you're getting deeper and deeper in the kak. Right, you can Google that and figure out what that is.
Okay, I think that we've heard a very clear message to the Norwegian Parliament, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of, yes, Eri, we have to take more responsibility. But I think that we should come back to we have two generals in this panel. And I'm not used to, Robert Mood being an activist from the old days. But now I can hear that he is speaking the same language as the young climate activists. So I think there is a big improvement in this discussion, following it for many decades in the Norwegian politics. So I think that we have this, situation that could call for action in a much, broader content than before. And if I may ask you, because I think that we know that climate change could be a threat multiplier. You all mentioned that. But do you also think that the defense ministries in the years to come has to be much more a part of how to deal with disaster risk management? Because in Europe, we are peaceful. It could be wildfires in Italy, in Spain, in France, creating very big crises. So do you think that the defense ministers should start training for this or be part of that? Could be landslides, could be a lot of disasters connected to climate change.
I'll be very short because I've stolen a lot of time already, but thank God that we are living in democracies where the politicians control the generals. So when the generals are in service, they swallow all the camels. When we put off the uniform, we have opinions and values and like all the rest of it, and then you can engage in a different way. Now, we need to face, one, the UN Security Council is not going to do this job for us. They won't. Those are the victors of the Second World War, and it is not going to reform itself in the next generation. The other point, before I go into very quickly what you asked about, is that money and military might is what is ruling the world today. We don't have an over-national leadership that is really effective. So that's when we need the networks of Tom, when we need the institutions, when you need the people coming together and working it from the bottom. In the Pentagon, they have several hundred planners working consequences of climate change as a threat. Tom knows much more about this dimension than what I do. If we go back to Norway, the way we work with all the aspects of local infrastructure, where we have a lot of catching up to do, the way we address local security and safety in cooperation between the fire services, the police, the Red Cross, all the others in a new way, and making sure that that is what is in focus, is going to impact, should impact the way the defense ministry interacts with finance and with the other ministries and the way they plan this for the future. Absolutely.
Malin, you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I would like to challenge this idea with the threat multiplier, and that is particularly recognizing the term threat. Threat is the primary connotation of threat is an external, it's something which is antagonistic towards us. Climate change is a systemic risk which we have created as humans, particularly some parts of humanity, not everyone. So I never use the threat concepts. I talk about risks. It's no doubt that climate change aggravates risks of insecurity for humans. It aggravates risks which could lead to intensified, prolonged conflicts. But it is the human actions constantly are involved in how climate change, what climate change will lead to. And I think, therefore, I think it's because I think words do matter, and it was also highlighted. We need to balance between recognizing the urgency, the seriousness about climate change, at the same time as we also provide hopes and prospects for a better future. And therefore, I think it's really key what labels we use in order to identify those. And I think that is, I don't know if everyone, we can have different opinions about that, but that is a take from our side, and also how we design the research. And this is also related to that on particularly violent conflicts, natural resource-driven violent conflicts, predominantly they are local, between communities. They are nevertheless less important, because those conflicts undermines the possibility for society to develop, become prosperity and fruitful and vibrant societies. So it is really to find this fine-grained, I think, how we label things in order to also being able to shape how we also respond to actions. Yeah.
So let's get this discussion between the two researchers in the panel. Howard, do you disagree or you have a comment? Welcome.
Actually, I don't think I disagree much with Malin. I share some of the same reservations, and which was also what I tried to allude to when I say that threat multiplier can be meaningful if you don't misuse the term. But if I may, let me reflect a little bit on something else that was mentioned earlier. Robert Mood said, and I think everybody shares this assessment, that thank God that we live in a democracy where the politicians control the military. But I was wondering also whether to some extent, and I don't have any simple answer to this myself, to some extent the democratic system seems somewhat unsuited to solve some of the main challenges associated with climate change, to the extent that politicians, despite their best intentions, to some extent are bounded or restricted by the voters. And Christian, you are a former politician, so if I may ask you if you have thought anything about this.
No, but I think, so this is something that we work on CISRO. We are, trying to dig into these kind of questions all the time, but I think that some of the research from our researchers is that many politicians have more support from the voters if they dare to take, more drastic climate steps, if they dare to challenge their voters. But we are in the middle of a local election campaign, and we have maybe signs that it's more those who are more against climate action are even more it's more hva heter det for noe på engelsk? Det heter something in English that I can't remember. It's it's more those who are in favor of action are more in favor of action, and those who are against are more polarized. Thank you so much. I know I can trust generals. But this is maybe our biggest challenge in the years to come: how to take action and make sure that this is understood by the voters, by people. And how may we take action in a way that is justice and that people support? Because we have to do something that is not very popular. And if we do it in a way that makes people just oppose it, then we are lost. So this is but I think that what we know from our research at CISRA, we know that politicians in all parties could be braver when it comes to climate policy. They could actually be in this dialogue with their own voters and trying to move them. So that is from my experience, negotiating with other parties on climate topics many times. But now I'm from the old days. We have people following us from all over the world, and they are welcome to send us some questions. And now I'll give you some questions from other parts of the world. Well, should we go to Stockholm? It's not that far. Stockholm, Benjamin in Stockholm, he asks, how can, with specific action, human rights organizations help reduce climate change? So this is a question for you, Kumi.
So firstly, we have to ensure that human rights is not being pushed back as we are seeing that's happening in the current moment, right? Because if we tried to pass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which turned 70 on the 10th of December last year in the UN General Assembly now, we won't even get off the starting blocks. So let's recognize that we have to ensure that everything that we do does not lose the huge body of international law and convention that we built around human rights. The second is we have to make sure that any intervention to address the climate change problem does not itself contribute a human right violation, whether it is cobalt from the DRC or indigenous people's lands in Latin America. But the third and most simple thing that the human rights movement needs to do is to climatize our existing work, right? We don't need to, because firstly, the human rights movement should not seek to be like the leader of the climate change fight. We just bringing a human rights perspective to it, right? And so in the way we do that, I think has to be organically linked to our work, and it's all there for you to see. What does Amnesty work on? Right to food, right to water, right to land, indigenous people's rights, refugee rights, migration, all of these things, climate is all over it, right? Then, if you look at gender equality, for example, or youth empowerment, all of these issues, you can see that climate is having an impact. So I would just end the answer by saying that I think one of the catastrophic mistakes we made as humanity in 1992 and afterwards was allowing climate change to be framed primarily and exclusively as an environmental issue. We should have understood it as a cross-cutting issue, and part of what we're doing right now is playing catch-up to try to bring the human-centric dimension to these issues, because if we don't do it, then we're always going to have the problem with voters, with the public, and so on. And let me just humbly say, though, right? I think the question of why we don't have action. Too many of our political leaders have been bought off lock, stock, and barrel by the fossil fuel industry, either directly or indirectly. That I would argue that actually it is not true that public opinion is against this issue now. Maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago even. In the UK, I just saw on the Sun newspaper, and then if you know the Sun, it's like a conservative right-wing newspaper. Front page says 95% of people in Britain now are concerned that climate change is a huge risk to their children and their future. So why? Because they had 1 day of 39-degree temperature in July. No, seriously, I was there. It was awful. But that's a kind of, we have to humanize our thing. And the other thing is, let me just say, one of the reasons we're failing is that there are too many people like me that are talking about these things. What I mean by that is we talk parts per million, degrees, targets, and so on. How many, okay, just think about this. How many ordinary people in the world, if they all tuned into our panel, would understand threat multiplier or risk or things that we are talking? We as leaders have an obligation to not be simplistic, but to make the conversation accessible so that ordinary people can enter it and feel that they have a part to play. The way we have framed the whole climate question, it really disempowers the possibility of people participating, and we have to address that. And thankfully, I think young people are helping us do that better than we can do on our own.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a question from Douglas in California, and he asks, how will the changing geographic, so locations like the Antarctic, pose future security and conflicts and challenges? And let's add the Arctic, because that is where it's really boiling at the time. So, Tom, maybe, well, the 1.5 report told us that if we succeed in keeping global warming at 1.5, the sea ice in the Arctic, or the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer every 100 years, once. And if we reach 2 degrees, it will be every 10th year. So it's really changing. It's really, you know, big geographic changes up there.
Yeah.
You have a comment?
No, absolutely.
Douglas?
If you look at climate change as a threat multiplier, which we talked about, and I fully appreciate that we need to make that more practical, I think the risk is big that it becomes more than a threat multiplier. It becomes a root cause of conflict. For 2 reasons. One is the geopolitical dimension to it. Arctic is melting away. It's opening up a completely new arena for geopolitical fractures and powers. There are a lot of resources there. There are a lot of claims, territorial claims. So there is a new friction appearing in the Arctic. Yeah. And that can cause, we have seen it in history happen over and over again, can cause conflict. A second cause is, of course, the water shortage. If you realize the big streams, the Jordan River and streams like that, they have become very small streams nowadays. And if you just realize that there are currently plans to build 3,600 dams all over the world, so every country tries to hold on to its water.
Yeah.
Imagine what happens downstream. The village is there, the country is there. And you can only imagine that that will become a new source of conflict. So there is a geopolitical dimension to climate change, also to energy transition. Energy transition will change the position of OPEC countries, will change the position of Russia and other countries that, for the economies, maybe even Norway, for the economies depend upon the income of fossil fuels. So energy transition threatens that income and will lead to power shifts globally. and will lead to friction. So there is a geopolitical security dimension as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the panelists. I think that you actually explained very complicated questions in a way that was possible to understand for people that are not experts on this topic. And that is of great importance because we are going to be in dialogue with other peoples outside of this building and outside of this, of those who are, interested in these topics. So thank you so much. It's time for lunch. You deserve it. Give them a big hand.
Good, thank you. Fully agree. Thank you all, and
All
thanks to
actors
Christina as
responsibility.
well for the great moderation. Now, there's lunch until 1:30. Now, there's a saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And that's the case here as well. We've got working tables, round tables in the afternoon. Now, that doesn't work in the way that it's only youth that are going to sit down and work for the future and identify solutions for reduced climate emissions, etc. We all have to work. I mean, that's basically the bottom line of this whole conference. If we are going to change the world, even us adults have to work. So I assume that everyone is going to sign up for round tables in the afternoon. We go for lunch now, then we have a panel, then we're going to sit down and work. So thank you very much and enjoy the lunch.
Welcome to Session 2, Climate Change and Migration. To introduce this session, please welcome photographer and filmmaker and member of the photo agency 7, Nicole Sobecki.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. For much of my career, I believed that my role as a photographer and as a filmmaker was to raise awareness. If people truly understood the future that we are creating for ourselves, they'd make different decisions. I don't believe that anymore. Everybody already knows about climate change. Everybody already knows. And yet we continue to fail to act in ways that are necessary for our own survival and the survival of our planet. I get it, it's hard. And human societies are not designed for quick and transformative change. But there is simply too much at stake to allow for acceptance or complacency. Without a revolution in how billions of us conduct our lives, large parts of this planet will become close to uninhabitable. And with that, the predictable crises and conflicts. Resources will become increasingly scarce. Many will be pushed from their homes entirely. In some parts of the world, like Somalia, that's already happening. A Climate for Conflict is a multi-year project that I worked on with my reporting partner, Laura Heaton, with whom I also co-directed the film that we showed earlier. The full version will be on the website. The project explores the relationship between the environment and security in Somalia, one of the places on the world most vulnerable to climate change. And for us, our work began with the discovery of thousands and thousands of photographs. They're part of the only comprehensive land survey ever created in Somalia, made in the late 70s and early 1980s. They were hidden away in the British countryside for 30, 35 years, and we decided to rescan them, bring them into the public, and then return to some of these locations to try to understand the degree to which Somalia's land had been transformed by climate change and environmental degradation. What we found, unfortunately, was very real and very dramatic transformation. But ultimately, It was the people that we met in the process of rephotographing these places and their stories that really came to matter. Meet Ayaan, a 16-year-old that I met in southeastern Somalia. 2 weeks before this photograph was made, Ayaan's uncle had been killed in a conflict over increasingly scarce grazing lands. Or this elder in Puntland, whose community is facing increasingly dramatic gully erosion, which is a really big problem when it's a nomadic community that needs to cross large tracts of land to graze their animals. Or Ahmed, who holds tight to the rope of this porcupine that he had captured after he had raised his fields. This is the story of a mother who didn't flee civil war, but fled the drought. Of the fishermen pushed into piracy because of empty nets and an increasingly depleted sea. Of the farmer, drawn by the words of al-Shabaab after his crops fail for multiple seasons. Somalia has long been a place beset by extremes. Lost my place. Somalia has long been a place beset by extremes, but climate change and environmental degradation are compounding those factors and leading to the end of a way of life. This is a scene from 2011 in Mogadishu during the drought-induced famine. A man and a woman are carrying another woman in a wheelbarrow. It's a photograph I shot from the Kasbah. And this is the port of Mogadishu, where fishermen return from a night at the sea in front of the once grand Aruba Hotel, now disintegrated. And a fisherman in Puntland, an area of Somalia largely known for its pirates. It's been a part of Hollywood's fantasies about the region, and it's quite well known. But what people don't understand very well is the environmental roots of piracy. Here, an anti-piracy group, police force, the Puntland Marine Police Force, search a fishing boat for arms. And here in the arid lands outside Marrero, which is a smuggling hub, migrants walk to caves where they'll wait and wait for night to fall and the boats to come that will take them on the perilous journey across the sea to Yemen and eventually, they hope, to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. After low rainy seasons for multiple years, the wells in Deg Mohammed's village dried up. This is an image of her that I took as she was packing up her home, loading it onto a wheelbarrow, and moving with her children to someplace unknown. And here, children studied in the madrasa in Dadaab refugee camp, which at the time this photograph was made was the largest refugee camp in the world. This is a woman collecting her rations at a food depot in Dadaab. And this photo always reminds me of the words of a Somali British poet, Warsan Shire. She says, don't leave home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And when you look at where you go to, it's easy to see why. And dusk falls on a street in Dadaab refugee camp. A mother bathes her child in the port of Mogadishu as the ships go out to sea for the night. And finally, in the ancient port city of Maid, a hawk takes flight in a town that now lays quiet and nearly abandoned. I'm not a scientist, and I don't write policy. I'm a storyteller. It's what's so wonderful about being here with you all, with all of our varied skills and expertise. Because I believe that if we are going to be able to act on the tremendous change to come, we are going to need new ideas. We are going to need new stories. And we are going to need to understand that the changes that need to come are far greater than any one of us as individuals. That's what I learned from Ahmed and Daoud and Ayan and countless others. This is not about borders. And Somalia's problems are far closer to your own than they may at first appear. To move forward together, we're going to need a new definition and a new vision of who we are. A human community, beyond any single identity, time, or place, facing a problem that none of us can solve on our own. Thank you very much.
The panel discussion on climate change and migration will be led by Head of the Secretariat of a Platform on Disaster Displacement, Atle Solberg.
Thank you very much to the organizers and to Oslo Pax for putting climate change and migration and displacement on the agenda. I'm very excited to be here today. And we also have a great panel that will teach us a little, or we will have a better understanding of what are some of the key challenges around climate change and displacement. And they will also help us to think about what could be some of the key messages we can bring to the climate summit. I would like to get started, so I would kindly ask my panelists to join me. Mari Eining from the Changemaker, Gronya O'Hara from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and François Germain from the Hugo Observatory at the University of Leeds. Please give them a warm applause. We have a slight change in program. We were supposed to have a keynote speak by Emla Regine Mathisen, who's the leader of Changemaker. She unfortunately fell ill and cannot join us. So we will have to do without the keynote speech. But I have asked our panelists, since we then will have a bit more time, and we also will be missing an introductory speech, that we spend some time on putting the issue into context. And I will start to just recap a little what we have heard today. I think we are coming, this panel, in a very good moment of time of this Oslo Pax, because already in the morning we have heard several examples how climate change and the adverse effect of climate change do play a role in the way people are moving and people are forced to move. We have already spoken about the hurricane Dorian that hit Bahamas over the weekend. And we heard that there were devastating impact on the island. We don't really know how many have been displaced yet, but we already know, for example, from Miami, that people are evacuated in the anticipation of the hurricane. So one aspect where climate change plays a role is how climate change are affecting extreme weather events, such as hurricane and tropical cyclones, and how these extreme weather events will increasingly displace people. Average estimation is that 26 million people are displaced in the context of sudden onset weather events and earthquakes every year. We have also heard that some of the more slow onset impacts of the adverse effect of climate change will affect how people are moving. We heard about sea level rise, desertification, glacial melting that will have an effect on livelihood. And we don't really know how many people have been moving or how many people are moving in the context of these more slow onset effects of climate change. We also know that slow onset events and processes such as sea level rise can easily combine with the sudden onset events. Think of the island of Tuvalu that the foreign minister spoke about this morning, the foreign minister of Norway. There's a low-lying atoll nation. It's already affected by coastal erosion and saltwater intrusion. And I don't think we need much imagination to think what will happen to an island like Tuvalu if it were to be hit by a tropical cyclone at the category of what we saw in Dorian in Bahamas. We also know that increasingly climate change do have an effect, or it can affect or even intensify conflicts. We heard that the link between climate change and conflict is uncertain, but there's clearly an impact on conflict situation by climate change, and we all know that conflicts do displace people. So these are some of the 4 scenarios we have heard about today. And what I would like our panelists to spend maybe in a first round of questions is to talk a little about what are the more specific knowledge, what do we know more about these dynamics where climate change and human mobility is involved, and how will this affect people? What is the human face of these processes? What are the specific needs of people? And we would also like to turn to responses, effective practices, and what we can do. Finally, I hope the panel can give us some clear ideas how we can, what will we like to communicate when Sophia is going to the United Nations Climate Summit? What should be the key messages coming out of this session? I also want to bring to your attention that we have Isaac from Nairobi also on the line, or together with us virtually. We will also bring him in to the panel at one moment. So I'm seeing Isaac on the screen here. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. So in about 15 minutes, depending a little how long Gronya and Mari and Francois is talking, I would like to turn to you, Isaac. Is that okay? Thanks. He's waving to me. Mm-hmm. So get started. Francois, you're an academic. Yes, you're an academic. Can you help us a little to put this together? What do we know about climate change on one side and all the pathway and linkages to the mobility of people? What do you think we need to know more about? And can you give us a flavor of some projection? I wanted to bring to your attention, since you just joined us at midday, that the foreign minister talked about the World Bank groundswell report in the morning. So there are some scary numbers out there that we may want to prepare for. So Francois, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I like the idea that you turn over to an academic with the hope that he would bring some more clarity. I'm afraid this is a bit naive, but...
Yeah. I can also, there was another phrase being used this morning by Penelope, is that it's complicated to make it simple, but please make it simple.
Yeah, but it's complicated. I'll do my very best. Indeed, what we know from the different studies, and I guess it's fair to say that research on this topic of the connection between climate change and migration really started some 20 years ago in the early 2000s. And when we first started investigating this topic, initially, climate change and migration appeared as a very new topic. And soon enough, the people displaced as a result of the impacts of climate change became a sort of incarnation of the human impacts of climate change. They were being used, I mean, in many communications as a way to convince people that climate change was already happening and that the impacts of climate change had already materialized. And if people needed proof, if people needed concrete evidence that climate change was a reality already, they could turn to the people on small island states, they could turn to people displaced by floods, by hurricanes, or by drought. And therefore, I think that that's a kind of initial flow that we made as a research community was perhaps to lock the figure of what we call then climate refugees, become some sort of a symbol of climate change, an incarnation of the human dimension of climate change. And then, as time went on, of course, research did make significant progress. And I think one of the most significant progress that research has made in the past few years was to try and untangle the categories. I think that in the minds of the public, there is still this perception that you have, on the one hand, the so-called political refugees who are being displaced as a result of conflicts or persecution. On the other hand, the so-called economic migrants who are looking for a better life, or better jobs, or better salaries. And then on the third hand, if I may say so, a new category would be the climate change migrants, people displaced as a result of the impacts of climate change. Yet, it doesn't work exactly like that. And this is where it becomes a bit complicated. Because the impacts of climate change do not directly displace people. Of course, in some extreme cases, like in the case of hurricanes, for example, people have to flee directly because of the hurricane. But in many, many cases, the impacts of climate change will actually weigh in on the other drivers of displacement, on the political drivers of displacement, on the economic drivers of displacement. Climate change will induce tensions for land in some places of the world. In other places of the world, climate change will compromise the livelihoods of people, which means that a lot of those whom we call political refugees or economic migrants are also moving in a way or another as a result of the impacts of climate change. Let me give you an example for this. At the moment in Europe, there are significant flocks of migrants coming from West Africa. And they come from Guinea, from Côte d'Ivoire, from Senegal. And when they arrive on the shore of Europe, European governments and public opinions call them economic migrants because they come from countries that are not at war. And therefore, it is assumed that they come to Europe in search of better opportunities and in search of a better life. Yet, when you look at their trajectory, at the migration route, you'll find that many of them come from rural areas and were sent by their families to cities and to towns because the families could no longer make a living out of agriculture as a result of rainfall variations, as a result of soil degradation. And then when they were in cities, sometimes they moved to the country next door and then to Niger, for example, or to Mali, and then some of them made it to Libya because they were caught in the net of smugglers and traffickers, and then at the end of the day, they arrived in Europe. So if you look at the different steps of their migration route, you will find that initially, they had to move out of the countryside, out of the rural area, because their family could no longer make a living out of agriculture. And in a way, it is a very Western bias to think that we can distinguish clearly the economic drivers of migration and the environmental drivers of migration. In many parts of the world, and certainly for the majority of humanity, the environment and the economy represents basically the same thing. When you see that in sub-Saharan Africa, about half of the population depend directly on agriculture as a primary source of income, and when we know that subsistence agriculture is extremely vulnerable to climate impacts, that means that every time there is an environmental change, it also induces an economic hardship for those people. And I think that this is one of the key progress that we've made in research, was to realize that the so-called climate change migrants were not a specific category distinct from other migration dynamics, but that climate change was a big factor weighing on the other drivers of migration. Another complication is the fact that people take their migration decision on the basis of a wide range of factors, which include, of course, the impacts of climate change, but which can also include, for example, their own perceptions of the impacts of climate change. And sometimes their perceptions of the changes are not the same as the observations of the change. And therefore, we need to take into account how people will perceive the change to understand how they make their own decision about migrating. And I think that, in a way, one of the difficulties of research is that the more we research into this, the more complicated it gets. And of course, the more complicated it gets to explain also to general audience and to policymakers. And I think this is a key challenge for research at the moment. Now, you've asked me about projections and about how many people we can expect to become migrants in the years to come. The difficulty of this and of these projections is that very often you don't have any idea of whether you're talking about cumulative numbers or about a certain number of people displaced at a certain moment in time. For example, when UNHCR puts every year the annual statistics of the number of people forcibly displaced in the world, The statistic is about the stock of people displaced. That is, at the end of the year 2018, some 68 million, if I don't say a lunatic figure, some 60 million people were displaced at that moment worldwide. When we make projections, what we don't know, whether we say 100 million, 250 million, or 300 million, what we don't know is whether we're talking about accumulative numbers or about a specific number of people displaced at a certain point in time. At the moment, we have very little clue about the duration of the displacement, about when people are able to return. And clearly, I think that's one of the key dimensions of climate change, is that in many parts of the world, return will be impossible. And I think that is a key difference with other types of forced displacement. When there is a war or political persecution, you can still hope that at some point, peace will come, or the dictator will be overthrown, and people will be able to return home, even though we have a lot of protracted situation of displacement. With climate change, in many cases, and I dare to say in most cases, return will be impossible, and we're talking about permanent displacement, which means that we will need to think together about how to relocate significant numbers of people. And clearly, when we see the state of the debate, at least in Europe, on migration and asylum, when we see the political crisis that every rescue boat in the Mediterranean induces amongst European governments, clearly we are not at all ready for a debate about a vast program of relocation of people who live in dangerous places and who will be permanently displaced in the future. The difficulty is to know when.
That's very good. Thank you so much. Maybe an applause for. So you say it's complicated, and we have to get out of that. It's complicated, and I will challenge you in the next round. So what are your specific policy proposal? How can we start to address this at the international level? I think you brought a very important aspect, which is some process might be irreversible. There might not be a durable solution for the displaced, which is return. So we have to think creatively that there will be people that cannot live in parts of the world where they're living today. And that presents some major challenges. Thank you, Francois. Now I want to turn over to Gronya. And Gronya, she told me this morning that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, they have been twice awarded the Peace Prize. So clearly, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees do have an important role to play in this conference and also in this area. We all know that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, you do play an important role. You are working on the ground. But we also know that you are primarily mandated to work with those or assist and protect those that flee persecution and conflict. And what I would like you to tell us a little about what is your thinking within the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as an organization on how to deal with some of the challenges that Francois spelled out, but also how you work in nexus situations. We heard this morning there is this distinction between disaster, climate change, and conflict. They sometimes collapse in front of our eyes. So please, Gronya.
Thank you very much, Atle, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us. I have to say that Oslo is a place, and Norway is a place where we feel very much at home as UNHCR, not just because we are the proud winners twice of the Nobel Prize, not me personally, the institution that I'm representing here today, but also because of Mr. Nansen and the history that Norway has with the issue of forced displacement. So it's a pleasure for us to be here today. Atle, you will be pleased to hear my team prepared a speech for me, but I'm not going to read that speech. But I have learned from participation in a lot of these conference events, that if you don't have a speech and if it's not on the website, sometimes it's almost like you were never there. So the speech I will leave for the website. I'm glad to see that we're also being webcast, so everything we're saying also becomes a bit more interactive. And I'll move immediately to the question you ask us, and I'll pick up, I hope, with the same kind of enthusiasm that we heard from some of the panelists earlier on, because I was particularly invigorated when I heard General Mood say that, you know, people say humanitarians don't do climate change, and he said, well, I have a lesson for you, they do every day. And people, and in particular sometimes member states, would like to think that UNHCR does not do climate change because there's somehow some bizarre firewall between the impacts of climate change and the work that we do and are mandated to do around forced displacement. So let me say that UNHCR does do climate change. We deal with it day in, day out. And there's three basic areas of interface, I think, that describe the extent of the work that UNHCR as an institution does with climate change. First of all, and you mentioned it in framing the question, there's the whole issue of nexus. Now, nexus is a very popular word around the UN these days. We have the nexus between peace and development. We have the nexus between peace and security and development. Well, UNHCR has its own nexus, and for us, one of the motivating factors and what we feel legitimizes our work around the question of climate change is the nexus between the impact of climate change, as has been described very eloquently by the previous speaker, as part of a multi-layered complexity where you look at climate, you look at poverty, you look at conflict. So we have a nexus, which is the nexus between the impact of these multi-layered effects that drive forcible displacement and the nexus to the 1951 Convention. And under what circumstances of analysis you can look at the complexity of all these factors that drive forced displacement. And I'm very deliberately saying forced displacement. I know we're working under a working title that says migration, but I'm deliberately using the term forced displacement because there is, I think, a distinction between being forced to move and migration, which tends to suggest some kind of option. And that's not always the case in the dynamics we're speaking about. So I'm using that term deliberately. So we have that nexus with the 1951 Convention where we as UNHCR say, if all these factors line up, and they are linked with a persecutory ground under the 1951 Convention. So we're not saying that climate change persecutes people. We're saying that in the complexity of all the different factors, if you link that with one of the 1951 grounds, which is race, nationality, religion, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group, you will have the right to international protection as a refugee. And we believe that more and more this applies to situations in which climate change is a fundamental feature. Second area where we have a job to do as UNHCR, the environmental impact of large-scale displacement. In the photographic exhibit that was displayed on screen to introduce this panel, you saw some pretty shocking pictures from Dadaab, which is one of the largest refugee concentrations on the globe. This picture particularly of the razor wire protecting the food distribution. We believe as UNHCR, and we know it from our direct operational experience, that we also have a role to play vis-a-vis the environmental impact of large-scale displacement. If you put a lot of refugees or IDPs packed together in a place like Dadaab, and there are many places like it on the globe, you deny people freedom of movement, you deny them in displacement the possibility of a dignified life through use of their own labor, then you end up with an environmental impact which is like a double impact, because these camps have a massive environmental impact. Immediate deforestation, I'm going to stumble now on this word, immediate disappearance of all trees, because in most of these locations they're depending on charcoal as the main fuel, depletion of water sources, so the fact of displacement itself can now further fuel environmental impact, which causes further displacement. And third, and I will stop here in the intro interests of spreading the word across the panel and making your life a bit easier as moderator. A third area where we feel we have a role to play is the whole question of how the continuation of climate change and environmental degradation undermines the prospects of solutions, as we say in our lingo, you use the term durable solutions, undermines the possibility of primarily voluntary repatriation for refugees and for internally displaced persons. What I'm talking about here is situations that have been mentioned by several of the previous speakers. So you've got your protracted conflict, which remains unresolved, but I'm thinking even of another layer of climate-related impact. Because what I learned working in Syria and Iraq, which had never occurred to me before, when people are displaced for a long period of time and agricultural land is abandoned, in some parts of the globe, that's a good thing, as we heard from our colleague from Amnesty International in the opening. Some parts of the globe, if land is abandoned and doesn't have human beings working it all the time, it will replenish. In some parts of the world where land is abandoned, it will go further and more quickly to desertification. So what I learned to my shock working in Syria and Iraq is that many of the farms previously worked by people who are now displaced are rapidly turning into desert. So even if the conflict is resolved, there's environmental and ongoing climatic impacts that will prevent people from ever being able to recover the livelihoods they had before. And I found that a very sobering thought, and it is the third, and I'll stop there, area where we feel UNHCR has a role to play across the very broad portfolio of climate change and environmental degradation.
Thank you, Gronia. That was very encouraging. We also get questions through Twitter, if I understand correctly. And we already got one to UNHCR, and it's from Emma, 26 in London. And she asks, is there something the United Nations and the UNHCR is not doing that you think you should be doing regarding climate change and conflict?
Good question.
Can we maybe let you ponder that?
Ponder on it.
And then we do a round.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would like to turn to Mari. And thank you so much for stepping in on such a short notice. That's very nice of you. And I just wanted to present Mari. She's former deputy leader of Changemaker, but she currently works for the Norwegian Church Aid. But today she will represent Changemaker, and she's stepping in or replacing Embla that couldn't join us. So just wanted to clarify that. And Mari, I think I would be very excited to learn about the campaign you Changemaker launched in June, and I was part of some of the meetings. And if you could tell us a little, what is the campaign all about? What do you try to achieve? And what has been some of the experience of launching the campaign on climate change and displacement so far? So the word is yours.
Yeah, I will be pleased to present it to you all. First of all, Changemaker, most of you, I guess, do not actually know our organization. It's a youth organization that works with development politics, and we work to make the world a better place, basically. And so our job is to bring the science and the UN and everything that we've heard now into a language that youth can understand and that can engage youth, and on second hand, that youth can bring their new knowledge and their new ideas and solutions to politicians, so that we can actually change the system that is not functioning, the system that is creating inequality. So we do that through campaigning. And our campaign on climate migration or climate-induced displacement is called Climate Passiveness, klimapassivitet. Please Google it. And it's a campaign where we look at the problems of climate change. And we see that climate change is inherently unjust, It's a problem that's created mostly by rich people, and is mostly affecting poor people and the most vulnerable people. And we see that climate-displaced people are the ones who are actually the most affected. And so we try to maybe take some of the knowledge, the science that you've brought, and translate it into policy. And first of all, to deal with this, in our perspective as changemaker, we feel that Norway has to step up their game. So all countries have to contribute to reducing climate gas emissions. And Norway's fair share of emission reductions is actually 430% by 2030, which is absurd. It's impossible to actually reduce more than 100%. So that's why we say that Norway has to reduce at least 53% of Norway's emissions within 2030. And in addition to that, Norway has to reduce emissions in other parts of the world and to work with climate adaptation and loss and damage through climate financing. So Changemaker is demanding that Norway gives 65 billion kroners in climate financing every year to contribute their part to tackling climate change. So that's part of the solution, because if we want to reduce the stress factors for climate migrants and hopefully make sure that people can actually stay where they want to stay, at home, and also help the people who have to migrate, we have to reduce emissions, and we have to adapt communities so that they can handle climate change. And then thirdly, because we're not going to be able to stop all emissions, and we are already seeing the impacts of climate change, people are already being displaced, we wanted to find a solution that could really tackle the human rights issues and security issues of the people who are displaced. And we're speaking about people who are internally displaced, but also people who are displaced across borders. And if you're a climate migrant or a climate displaced person and you cross a border, suddenly you don't have any rights anymore, because nation states are the ones who are obliged to provide you with your human rights, make sure that you're safe, make sure that you're well. But once you're outside of your own country and you're not recognized as a refugee, then you don't have any institution or body that can actually provide you with these rights, make sure that you are safe and secure and have water, shelter, for instance. And so we wanted to tackle this problem, and we are suggesting a climate passport based on the Nansen passport. I don't know if you've heard about the Nansen passport, but after the war, there were a lot of people who were displaced in Europe, and they didn't have any place to go. And so a Nansen passport was created in the name of Fridtjof Nansen, and people were allowed to go to safe havens, to countries where there was not war, where people could live safely and be provided with security, with protection and their basic human needs and rights. And we want to see if this is possible to create again for climate migrants, climate displaced people, because we know that there are a lot of people who are already fleeing their countries, and in the future there will be even more people. And if we don't have an international system that can support these people and help them, our society, or the global society, will have failed these people.
Thank you. Can I? I think the comprehensive approach you're recommending about focusing on climate action, focusing on resilience, adaptation, and then deal with the consequences if we cannot mitigate. I think that's a very good policy recommendation. Can you tell us a little how the reaction to the campaign has been, and probably primarily around the climate passport? What has been some of the feedback and the reaction to that idea?
So we launched the campaign in June on our camp, basically, for the members of Changemaker, where you were as well. And so far, there hasn't been so much reaction to the demand for climate passports. But we've seen with a school strikes for climate that there are more and more people supporting our demands to reduce emissions and to give climate financing, which is amazing. Even the government is almost getting there now. And so we're really happy about that if they actually go through. But the suggestion or the solution to have a climate passport hasn't really reached that far yet. We know that there are parties also in the government who are supportive of such a solution. The left party, Venstre, has suggested to have a similar solution. That then they said that climate migrants should be able to come to Norway. But then there are other parties in the government who say no to all migrants at the moment. So it's a really difficult. It's a really difficult demand, and especially right now in the migration crisis that's happening at the moment, European countries are really afraid of migrants, and it's difficult to go through with this plan. But for us, we have to come up with a global solution that will actually help people. And so we can't just give the small answers. We have to look at the systemic issues. And the systemic issue is that climate migrants do not have their rights supported.
And you have just started. It's not a short project. It takes some time. So I would like later maybe Francois and Gronia to reflect a little on the opportunities and maybe also the limitation of such an idea. There are governments that are seriously talking about humanitarian visa, temporary protection system, so it's not an idea that only sits with Changemaker. There are governments that are willing to entertain different mechanisms. So I think it's a promising avenue to explore. I want to now get back to Isak, or not get back to you. You have been waiting. I think I promised to bring you in after 15 minutes, and I failed around 10 minutes late. But Isak, you are the chairman of the Matare Environmental Conservation Group, MECYG. And I understand that you do some excellent work on the ground and also for people that may have moved in due to the impact of climate change in the rural communities. So could maybe you tell us a little what you are doing specifically on the ground and how the people you are working with have been affected by the adverse effect of climate change. So over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll go straight to my points. And I think we should not conflate migrants, asylum seekers, and IDPs. Each category is distinct. Just as we must understand youth and elder persons have different needs. The majority of forced migration today is to cities. Internal displacement is an increasingly urban phenomenon. Displacement also increasingly takes place within cities, whether the result of urban conflict, disaster, or infrastructure and urban renewal projects. This year, Global Report on International Displacement 2019 focuses on the urbanization of internal displacement, but climate change scenarios were not applied to the model just as the evidence increasingly points towards the accelerating vector of existing issues that climate change represents. Migrants, refugees, internally displaced persons, and returnees now predominantly seek safety, access to service, and livelihood in urban areas rather than camps. Often, this means reduced access to economic and educational opportunities. When economic and educational opportunities are limited or non-existent, violence and exploitation rise, with youth and women most affected. We need meaningful participation of youth, especially women and girls, to combat resulting inequalities. This must include bottom-up solutions to climate change and job creation to help prevent the resolved social tensions that may otherwise lead to conflict. UN Habitat job creation program in urban waste management and other labor-intensive and thus high job creation programs are proven tools to this end. There exists a climate change trafficking in person nexus 2, to which youth, especially in vulnerable climate changes, will strip population of their assets and options, forcing them into precarious and exploitative labor conditions and rendering them overall vulnerable to third parties willing to prey on them. The importance of engaging for youth to solve the issues they face cannot be understated. My own story is that I went back to my community to help youth stay out of crime, to offer them alternative and to protect them from police and other state actors who further marginalize my community. The psychological impact of displacement is also significant. The upheaval of moving may be destabilizing, and the struggle to survive is unfamiliar surrounding. Often alone adds to people's stress. Domestic violence may increase among families who move as a unit, and indigenous people may also face additional trauma because of discrimination and detachment from their ancestral lands. Children and youth participation are marked for life, but such psychological trauma, which is cumulative. Climate change induced displacement will worsen existing challenges associated with IDP populations and human migration more generally, and accelerate the rate of displacement. Rapid urbanization always been difficult to manage and resulted into urban sprawl, tensions between and which communities and reduce opportunities for all involved. If youth is not adequately integrated in combating this dynamic, everyone involved loses out. If we want to highlight the potential, creativity, and energy youth can bring to their communities, we must also highlight the policies that restrict them to achieve their potential. In sudden onset contexts, such as when major earthquakes occur, displacement brings the disruption in normal life and livelihood and heightened protection concerns for people with specific needs and rendered homeless, such as women, children, older people, and people with disabilities. UN Habitat's one-stop youth centers are part of the answers to engage the impact of climate change on human migration and internal displacement. They serve as incubators for youths to be trained and supported to create solutions their communities and themselves face. Migration itself independent and asylum seekers is mostly inter-regional and should be supported as it allows for adoption, labor market efficiency gains, and well as remittances. Lowering remittance fees is a key policy to support individuals and their social work adapting and building resilience to climate change, which also providing economic redistribution and gains. It is often young men in regions such as SSA that are sent to send remittance. We need to engage with this dynamic and enable them to provide safety nets for their families back home. Children, older people, and those with disabilities are among the groups worst affected by displacement. Education opportunities may be better in urban areas, but the struggle to meet families' increased living costs and basic needs may result in children being taken out of education in order to work. Many new arrivals also suffer deteriorating health in the form of new conditions or the worsening of existing ones. As a result of changes in climate, inadequate shelter, overwork, poor working condition, stress and reduced nutrition. This makes it possible for criminal groups to activate, recruit youth facing a lack of option, active exploitation, or mere survival. As with education, health and care facilities may be better in urban areas, but economic hardship put them out of reach for any displacement persons.
Isaac? Can you hear me, Isaac?
Yes, I can hear you.
This is Atle. We have exactly 10 minutes left now, and we wanted to have a round from all the panelists. So if I kindly ask you to conclude your intervention, would that be okay?
Yeah. Okay. So, in Guatemala, research showed internal displacement leading to few improvement in people's lives. This is not a general truth, but the result of policy failures. One exception, however, is when new arrivals have skills which allow them to access employment opportunities in urban centers and when available in rural areas. This, in turn, may also improve their access to education and healthcare services. Some people, such as members of LGBT communities, may find greater acceptance in urban areas, or at least that they are more able to social integrate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great. I think we heard so much about some of the impacts of displacement. We also heard some good thinking around how to address some of these challenges. So thank you so much for that. We have 10 minutes left. So I would like us now to turn a little focus towards the climate summit. Tomorrow we will, if I understand correctly, present some key messages that will be handed over to the United Nations Secretary General. So Francois, I know it's complicated, but can you please give us some ideas about how can we do better in terms of policy and institution and money and the way we are working?
I think one general principle as to how we can do better is, I think at least from a perspective of Western countries, that Western countries need to do more than their share. I'd like to take the example of the country I'm from, Belgium. That's a tiny little insignificant country of about 11 million inhabitants. This country represents 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which is already quite a lot, when you think that we're only 11 million. And a lot of the discussion right now on climate policies in Belgium is we should do our share and reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, you have people telling, well, you know, Belgium is only 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emission. What difference will it make? And I'm struck by the fact that Belgium is an incredibly wealthy country, And the priority seems to reduce the domestic emissions so that Belgium is on track of the Paris Agreement. And I'd like to tell them, Belgium needs to do more than that. I mean, when you are a rich Western country, you cannot think that your climate policy is limited to your national boundary. Not only do you need to commit adaptation funding to try to limit the impacts of climate change in other countries, but you also need to think about what you can do as a rich country to help other countries, emerging countries and developing countries in particular, to also reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. Because if all Western countries do only their share, and even that they're not doing at the moment, but if they were to do only their share, that will not be enough. And I think that we need to regain some sense of international cooperation and what each country can do beyond its own borders. And that's the difficulty at the moment because public opinions are not yet ready for that.
Thank you so much. In the area of international migration management, and I would like you to comment a little on the climate passport. Do you see any specific proposal you think should be carried forward? I'm talking about those moving across international borders.
I think that the Global Compact on Migration, which was adopted last year, represents a very significant step in the right direction. It recognizes climate change as a migration driver, it encourages international cooperation, and I think that on paper, it looks very good and very promising. The problem at the moment is that countries are so reluctant to discuss about migration in international fora and to discuss about the global governance or international cooperation on migration because they see it as a fundamental part of the national sovereignty, and they feel that they would abandon or relinquish their national sovereignty if they were to participate in global mechanisms of better regulation and organization of migration. And yet, that's the thing with climate change and migration. The better you will organize these flows in advance, the better chances you have to maximize the benefits of migration for the migrants themselves, but also for the host communities and for the origin communities. And countries like to wait until the very last moment so that they're in a crisis situation that will only fuel extremism and nationalism and xenophobia. And they fray about international cooperation. I think we need to convince governments that the better they will anticipate and the more they will cooperate on these issues, the best it will be for everyone, including for their own interests.
Thank you so much, Francois. Gronya. There is a question here which is very similar to one of the one I wanted to ask you. So I read this one from Mira, 31 years of age, from Oslo. It says, to Gronya, do you think a climate passport is something that can actually be implemented? Can it be done? And then I also would like you, we have 7 minutes left, to think a little, think loud about some messages for the climate summit.
Okay. So many things have been said. There's so many things to react to, but I try to be disciplined, Atle. To Mira, and I haven't forgot about Emma. You asked me a question earlier. Emma in the UK is still waiting for an answer. So on the question of the climate passport, and I wholeheartedly agree with everything that has just been said by Francois. For states, the act of crossing an international border is potentially one of the most sensitive, defining features of their sovereignty. At the same time, international refugee law is premised on the fact that there are legitimate exemptions or exceptions to state sovereignty when it comes to the need of protection. So I would say about the campaign, I would say, be bold. Try to push for new ideas, but as you do so, be aware of what's already existing and use to the maximum the tools that already exist. The Nansen passport is very dear to us in UNHCR because it has its natural successor in the 1951 Convention travel document. If you look at the 1951 Convention and its schedule, you will see there the evolution of what was originally Nansen's idea. And if you look, as was mentioned by Francois, at the 2 compacts that were endorsed by the General Assembly, because there are 2, there is one on safe, orderly, and predictable migration, and there is one on refugees. And there you will see a lot of scope for looking at, okay, what are the avenues for what we in our UNHCR jargon, all of us institutions have our own jargon, we call complementary pathways or safe passage routes. So there's a lot out there. There's a lot of tools already existing. You will get pushback. You will be told that because of sovereignty issues, there can never be such a thing that will allow for free movement of people around the globe. And yet, if we look regionally, there already are in existence some similar like regional arrangements for free movement. ECOWAS has it in West Africa. The CARICOM is trying to develop something similar in the Caribbean. Within the European Union, we all have our European Union passport, and it gives us free movement. So, you know, things that people felt were impossible maybe in the past because of political or legal restrictions, they can be possible. I would just say to the campaign and around this idea, use to the maximum what already exists. Because I think that's the way to build on positive policy outcomes. A quick reflection on something that was said earlier and even in earlier sessions about the whole question of terminology and the question of projections. Now, 2 words you will never hear out of my mouth, although I'm just about to say them, is climate refugee. It makes no sense in the realm of international refugee law to talk about a climate refugee. You don't become a refugee because of the impact of climate change. You become a refugee because of the combination of a number of factors which underlines a persecution in terms of the 1951 Convention, which gives you then a legitimate right to international protection. I have a bit of an aversion. I mean, I realize why, you know, it's a catchy phrase and it's used a lot in the media, and I understand why, but I also think it can be kind of weaponized in a negative way. And because we're dealing in a world that is so polarized around human mobility, when you stick together terms like climate refugee with projections of tens of millions, this evokes in the minds of some policymakers the idea that, oh, well, if that's the case, there's too many, let's shut everything down. So I think in terms of language and influencing policy, we have to be careful about how we describe things, and we have to leverage where there's already openings. Saying that should not limit in any way the bold nature of the ideas that the youth delegates are going to take to the summit in New York. Suggestions for the summit. My boss will be there, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, will be there. Any of you who are attending, approach him, lobby him. You will find that he has big ears for listening to all of these issues around climate change. He has got his own Global Youth Advisory Committee coming out of a High Commissioner's dialogue of 2-3 years ago. So he also has a commitment to raising the voice of youth, and I think maybe there is some scope where we could see how youth voices around the climate change agenda could be matched up with the voices of refugees and IDPs who could bring, I think, an added dimension to this discussion, as our young friend from Nairobi just did with his very eloquent explanation of how the dynamics of displacement work. And the dynamics of displacement work towards, first, urbanization, second, most people that are displaced by the ongoing impact of climate change as part of bigger dynamics, their first step is not to wake up one morning and go, I think I'll go to Belgium or Ireland or Norway. You know, first it's urbanization, then it's countries, so it's the home state that bears the most burden, then it's countries in the immediate region, and we have to really dispel this notion, which I think is sometimes paralyzing to positive policy development, that there's this huge number of people just waiting to descend upon the westernized world, which is not actually what reality and operational observation shows us, which is not to say we should diminish the fact that there are going to be more people on the move, but we have to be careful about how we frame things and how we make our argument to bring more people on board. And in answer to Emma, who's been waiting a long time, these are the things I think that the UN needs to be doing more of. It needs to be pushing more the positive policy agenda. And I would just say, and then I will promise I will stop there, that when we talk about what the UN could and should be doing, you'll see a lot of good practice and you'll hear a lot of positive things coming out of some of the UN agencies, because we're proud of the work we do, whether it's UNHCR, whether it's Habitat, we heard a bit of their work. But then there's the part of the UN that's the political part of the UN that is the member states themselves. And this is, I think, where we have to have the push, moving into the Secretary General Summit in New York and moving beyond that to the Conference of State Parties in Chile, where we will have another opportunity to really push strong advocacy messages with the states that make up the UN.
Thank you. So maybe Sophia, right? You are carrying the message, could meet with the High Commissioner Grandi and we could set up the meeting already now. That would be something concrete. I understand I have 5 more minutes. I hope my understanding is correct. 3 more minutes. So, Mari, you have 90 seconds. Give us some fresh ideas on how to go to New York.
Well, this is difficult. What we want to get out of the climate summit in New York is to see all the countries committing to new targets that are actually in line with the 1.5 degree target, because the Paris Agreement goals are not. So that's the first step, and that's why they have the summit, so that countries will actually commit, and then they have to come home and actually do the action and cut emissions. In addition, we want Norway and all other rich countries who are capable of giving finance, we want them to give more climate finance, because there's definitely not enough climate financing for mitigation, but definitely not for adaptation at the moment. And under adaptation and loss and damage is also climate-induced displacement. So if we are going to be able to work with or against climate-induced displacement, or to handle climate-induced displacement in a better way, we need more action on loss and damage, and that's what they're going to discuss in December. So it's really, really interesting, and it's really important that we actually get some movement there. I want Guterres to not let the parties leave before they commit to more, actually. Keep them over there in New York.
Excellent. And Isaac, you will have the final words. You also have a 90 seconds. Would that be okay? I'm sorry we are running out of time.
Yeah, that's okay with me. So I forgot to talk about what we do in my organization. So I'll talk briefly about it. So in my organization, we'll try to look at the challenges that are affecting our community, and the issue of insecurity, the issue of waste management, and also the issue of unemployment is a big problem. So we try to look at the challenges that are affecting our community, and by looking at them, we turn them into opportunities. And one of them is like collecting waste and taking it to a collection point where it's away from the community. So by doing that, we end up like creating job amongst ourselves, and also reducing the crime rate, and making sure that our environment is good and it's clean, and also young people are getting opportunities out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Excellent. congratulations for the great work you're doing. I think my job is then coming to an end. We will have working sessions on climate change and migration. I think we got a lot of good ideas, some fresh ideas, some advice from this panel. So let's bring those conclusions and observation into the working group, and let's formulate some good messages that Sophie will bring to or take to New York in September. So a big applause to the entire panel, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Atle, and thanks to a great panel. Now, we are going to take all of this forward. We are going to take the input from this panel, Isaac in Nairobi, and what we've heard previously during the day. And we are going to take that together with our experiences from earlier, the competences and organizational background that we all have, as well as our views on how the world should be and where we want it to move. And we are going to build step by step in the work tables, the round tables in the neighboring room where you had lunch, and actually start identifying solutions. So if you want to have an impact on what comes out of this Oslo Pax conference, if you have views on climate and peace, and you think it's the responsibility to act, you better feed into the working groups, because that's going to be carried forward by the chair and others further to the climate summit in September. Okay, so now we have Carl Svensson from the JCI, from the Junior Chamber International, who will help you get started. Just follow him, and good luck, all of you. I will be in there. I'm sure I will see all of you as well. Good luck.